Andrea Walker's hands trembled as she rearranged the priceless painting on the wall of the penthouse she was hired to clean. Behind her, the deep voice that had been barking orders into a phone fell silent. "What exactly do you think you're doing?" She turned to face a man whose cold blue eyes matched the intensity of his tailored suit. Norman Harbrook, billionaire and her new employer, stared at her as if she'd committed a crime. "Fixing your Monet's water lilies," she replied matter-of-factly. "It's been hanging crooked for months. The imbalance disrupts the painting's serenity, exactly what Monet was trying to capture." "Hello once again, my beautiful royal story family. I'm curious, where in this beautiful world are you watching from today? Whether you're in a bustling city or a quiet village, drop your location in the comments below. If you enjoy these stories, please subscribe and hit the notification bell to join our royal story family. You'll never miss a new upload. Andrea took a deep breath as she stepped through the opulent marble lobby of Harbrook Tower. The security guard at the front desk eyed her skeptically, his gaze lingering a moment too long on her curvy figure before dropping to the cleaning supplies in her hands. "I'm the replacement for Mrs. Santos," she explained, trying to keep her voice steady. "For the penthouse." The guard raised an eyebrow. "You're the cleaner?" Andrea straightened her shoulders, a practiced response to the subtle judgment. "Yes, Andrea Walker, I should be on your list." After a call to verify and an uncomfortably long elevator ride to the top floor, she was greeted by an elegant older woman with silver hair and kind eyes. "You must be Andrea. I'm Eleanor Prescott, the housekeeper. Thank goodness you're here. Mrs. Santos's daughter had her baby early, and I've been trying to manage everything myself." She ushered Andrea in with a warm smile that immediately put her at ease. The penthouse took her breath away. Floor-to-ceiling windows showcased the city sprawled below like a living painting. But it was the art collection that made her heart skip. Museum-quality pieces arranged throughout the space with precision that bordered on clinical. "Mr. Harbrook is rarely home," Mrs. Prescott explained as she showed Andrea around. "He travels constantly for business. You'll likely never see him." Andrea nodded, her eyes drawn to a Monet on the far wall. "Water lilies," she whispered. "You know art?" Mrs. Prescott asked, surprised. "I was a gallery curator before." Andrea trailed off, not wanting to revisit the painful downsizing that had left her scrambling for work. "Before I started cleaning." Mrs. Prescott's eyes softened with understanding. "Well, the art is Mr. Harbrook's passion. Though I sometimes wonder if he truly sees it anymore. He collects masterpieces like others collect business cards." After Mrs. Prescott left, Andrea began her work, trying to ignore the whisper of the life she'd lost. As she dusted frames that once would have been under her professional care, she noticed immediately that several pieces were arranged incorrectly. A Rothko positioned where the morning light would hit it directly, fading its vibrant colors. A delicate Japanese print hung too close to an air vent. And the Monet? She couldn't help herself. It was hanging slightly askew, disrupting the carefully created sense of tranquility that made Monet's work so profound. Without thinking, she gently adjusted it, her trained eye seeking the perfect balance. "What exactly do you think you're doing?" The deep voice froze her in place. She turned slowly to face a man whose photograph she'd seen in countless business magazines, but who was far more intimidating in person. Norman Harbrook stood in the doorway, cell phone in hand, his tailored suit emphasizing his broad shoulders and his blue eyes cold with suspicion. "Fixing your Monet," she said, refusing to be cowed. "It's been hanging crooked for months. The imbalance disrupts the painting's serenity." Exactly what Monet was trying to capture. His eyebrows rose slightly, the only indication of surprise on his otherwise impassive face. "And you know this because I have a master's degree in art history and was a curator at the Hamilton Gallery until they closed last year." She stepped back from the painting. "I apologize if I overstepped. I just couldn't bear to see it hanging incorrectly." Norman studied her for a long moment, his gaze taking in her simple clothes, her curves, her determined expression. Something flickered in his eyes. Curiosity, perhaps. "The Hamilton? They had an impressive impressionist collection." "Yes," she said, surprised he knew. "I helped curate their last major exhibition before the economic downturn forced them to close." He walked closer, inspecting the painting with a critical eye. And you believe this placement is more appropriate? I know it is. The composition is meant to create a sense of endless horizon, drawing the viewer into a meditative state. When it's tilted, the illusion breaks. Norman seemed to consider this, his expression unreadable. Then he turned abruptly back to his phone. I have a call with Tokyo in 5 minutes. Try not to rearrange anything else without permission. Of course, she replied, but he was already walking away, barking orders into his phone again. Andrea released the breath she didn't realize she'd been holding. Something about his presence filled the room, making the vast penthouse feel suddenly smaller. She returned to her cleaning, hyper-aware of his voice drifting from the office down the hall. Later, as she was dusting a glass case containing a small, bronze sculpture, Norman emerged with a stack of papers. He paused, watching her work. You're being careful with that? It's a Giacometti. I know, she said quietly. The elongated form, capturing human isolation in post-war Europe. It's exquisite. Again, that flicker of surprise in his eyes. He approached, holding out several documents. These need to be filed in the cabinet by the piano, alphabetically. As she reached for the papers, their fingers brushed. A jolt of unexpected electricity passed between them, and for a brief moment, his cold mask slipped. Their eyes met, and Andrea felt a flush of heat rise to her cheeks. Norman withdrew his hand quickly, as if burned. I'll be in my office. Don't disturb me unless it's urgent. As he walked away, Andrea tried to calm her racing heart. What was that? She had no business feeling anything for a man like Norman Harbrook. He lived in a world she could only clean, not inhabit. From the doorway to the kitchen, Mrs. Prescott watched the exchange with a knowing smile. When Andrea finally left that evening, Norman stood at the window, watching her exit the building far below. He hadn't expected to be home when the new cleaner arrived. He certainly hadn't expected someone like her, someone who could look at his carefully curated collection and see what he himself had forgotten to notice. Someone whose warm brown eyes held both intelligence and challenge. He turned back to the Monet, studying it with new eyes. She was right. It looked better now. The realization unsettled him more than he cared to admit. Have you ever had an unexpected connection with someone who seemed your complete opposite? Share your experience in the comments. Andrea returned to the penthouse 3 days later, telling herself the flutter in her stomach was nervousness about keeping the job, not anticipation of seeing Norman again. Mrs. Prescott greeted her with a warm smile. Mr. Harbrook mentioned your art knowledge, she said, eyes twinkling. He rarely notices the cleaning staff at all, let alone remembers their names. Andrea busied herself arranging her supplies. I'm sure he was just surprised to find someone touching his valuable collection. Perhaps, Mrs. Prescott replied, unconvinced. He'll be working from home again today. In his office, he's been doing that more often lately. She gave Andrea a meaningful look that Andrea pretended not to notice. The morning passed quietly as Andrea cleaned, moving from room to room with careful efficiency. The art collection continued to captivate her. Each piece revealed something about Norman that his cold exterior tried to hide. The stark modern pieces in his office spoke of analytical precision. The Renaissance drawings in the library suggested classical education and respect for tradition. But it was the Impressionist works in the main living area that intrigued her most. They seemed at odds with everything else, hints of a softer sensibility buried beneath his corporate armor. As she dusted the bookshelves in the study, she heard Norman's voice rising from his office. No, that's unacceptable. The entire team needs to work through the weekend. This launch cannot be delayed. Andrea frowned, pausing in her work. A moment later, his office door swung open, and he stalked down the hall, still on his phone. I don't care if it's his anniversary. He signed up for this project knowing the demands. He noticed Andrea and nodded curtly before continuing his conversation. When he finally ended the call, Andrea couldn't help herself. You know, studies show productivity actually decreases when people work without proper breaks. Norman turned to her, eyebrows raised. Excuse me? Your team. Making them work through the weekend won't necessarily get better results. She continued organizing the books, not meeting his eyes. The human brain needs rest to function optimally. Even billionaires need to sleep sometimes. I wasn't aware that art history included courses in business management. Andrea finally looked at him. It doesn't, but I did run a gallery with 15 employees on a shoestring budget. We accomplished more when I respected their time and well-being. Norman moved closer, his tall frame imposing in the narrow space between bookshelves. And how is that working out for you now? The barge stung, but Andrea refused to show it. The gallery closed because of economic factors beyond my control, not because of my management style. Some things even money can't fix, Mr. Harbrook. They stood face to face, the tension between them crackling. Andrea was suddenly very aware of how close he was, how his cologne carried notes of sandalwood and cedar, how his eyes weren't simply blue but contained flecks of silver that matched the distinguished gray at his temples. That's a rather simplistic view of wealth, he said, his voice lower now. Perhaps, but there's nothing simple about treating people like machines. Norman's eyes narrowed. His chest rose and fell with a deep breath, and for a moment, Andrea thought he might fire her on the spot. Instead, something unexpected happened. The corner of his mouth twitched in what might have been the ghost of a smile. I'll take your management advice under consideration, Miss Walker. He turned to leave, then paused. The Monet does look better, by the way. Later that afternoon, Andrea was on a stepladder adjusting a light fixture when it shifted unexpectedly. She gasped as she lost her balance, the ladder wobbling precariously. Suddenly, strong hands gripped her waist, steadying her. Careful, Norman said, his voice close to her ear. Andrea froze, acutely aware of his hands on her body, the warmth of them seeping through her clothes. He held her firmly, his grip neither hesitant nor uncomfortable despite her curvy figure. When she was stable, his hands lingered a moment longer than necessary before he slowly released her. She turned on the ladder to thank him and found his face inches from hers. For a breathless moment, neither spoke. His eyes dropped briefly to her lips before he stepped back. Perhaps leave the light fixtures to maintenance, he said, his professional mask firmly back in place. Of course, thank you. As he walked away, Andrea pressed a hand to her racing heart. This was dangerous territory. Norman Harbrook was her employer, a man from a different world. Whatever this tension was between them could lead nowhere good. That evening, as she was preparing to leave, Andrea was drawn to the beautiful grand piano in the corner of the living room. It was clearly more than decorative. Sheet music sat on the stand, though it was covered with a fine layer of dust that suggested it hadn't been played recently. She couldn't resist. Sitting on the bench, she gently played a few notes, the sound rich and perfectly tuned. Before she knew it, she was playing Debussy's Clair de Lune, losing herself in the music as her fingers remembered what they hadn't been allowed to do in months. You play beautifully. Andrea's hands froze on the keys. Norman stood in the archway, watching her with an unreadable expression. I'm sorry, she said, standing quickly. I shouldn't have. No, please. He moved into the room. Continue. I should go. It's getting late. Norman approached the piano, running his fingers lightly over the polished surface. Where did you learn to play? My grandmother taught me. She cleaned houses too, but she played in church on Sundays. Andrea smiled at the memory. She said music and art were how the soul spoke when words failed. Something shifted in Norman's expression. My mother used to say something similar. She taught you to play? He nodded, an unexpected vulnerability crossing his features. This was her piano. The revelation hung in the air between them, a piece of himself offered without calculation. Andrea sensed there was more to the story, but before she could respond, Norman's phone rang. The spell broke as he checked the caller ID. I need to take this. It's my father. His voice had returned to its professional coldness. Of course, I'll see you next week, Mr. Harbrook. As she gathered her things, she could hear his conversation from the other room. His tone clipped and formal. Yes, Father, I'm aware of the board's concerns. Mrs. Prescott appeared at her side, helping her with her coat. His father, she said quietly, is the reason Norman keeps everyone at arm's length. Richard Harbrook is a brilliant businessman but a terrible father. Taught Norman that emotions are weaknesses to be eliminated, not experiences to be embraced. That's sad, Andrea said, glancing toward the sound of Norman's voice. Yes. Mrs. Prescott's eyes held the wisdom of someone who had watched from the sidelines for years. But I've noticed something interesting lately. Since you started coming here, he's been different, working from home more often. He even asked about you. About me? Your background, your experience. She smiled. He never asks about the staff. Andrea didn't know how to respond to that. I should go. My sister is expecting me for dinner. As she rode the elevator down, Andrea tried to make sense of the day's interactions. The tension when they argued. The electricity when he caught her. The unexpected moment of connection over the piano. None of it made sense. Men like Norman didn't notice women like her. Women who cleaned their homes for a living. Women whose curves didn't match magazine standards. Women who challenged their authority. And yet, there was something in his eyes when he looked at her that made her wonder if perhaps he saw beyond those surface distinctions to something deeper, something that resonated with his own carefully hidden humanity. The thought was both thrilling and terrifying. The following week, dark clouds gathered over the city, promising a fierce summer storm. Andrea arrived at the penthouse to find Mrs. Prescott fussing over weather alerts on her phone. They're saying it could be one of the worst electrical storms in years, she said, her forehead creased with worry. I need to leave early to check on my sister across town. Will you be all right finishing up alone? Of course, Andrea assured her. Is Mr. Harbrook here today? In his office, on call since dawn. Mrs. Prescott lowered her voice. He doesn't do well with storms. Never has since. She caught herself. Well, it's not my story to tell. Just, perhaps check on him if it gets bad. After Mrs. Prescott left, Andrea worked methodically through the penthouse, occasionally glancing at the darkening sky outside. The first rumble of thunder came as she was organizing the library. A distant growl that made the windows vibrate slightly. In the silence that followed, she realized she could no longer hear Norman's voice from the office. The penthouse felt suddenly too quiet. She continued working, but as the storm intensified, lighting flashed brighter and thunder crashed louder, rattling the art on the walls. During a particularly violent thunderclap, Andrea heard something from the direction of Norman's office, a sound that didn't belong with the storm. She hesitated outside his door, listening. Another crash of thunder, and there it was again, a gasping sound, like someone struggling to breathe. Mr. Harbrook, she called, knocking softly. No response. Concerned, she opened the door to find Norman sitting rigidly behind his desk, his normally composed face ashen, his knuckles white where they gripped the armrests. His breathing was shallow and rapid, his eyes unfocused. Mr. Harbrook, she said again, moving quickly to his side. Norman? His eyes found hers. Pupils dilated with fear. I can't, he gasped. I can't breathe. Andrea recognized the signs immediately. You're having a panic attack, she said gently, crouching beside his chair. I need you to focus on my voice, okay? You're safe. Another thunderclap shook the building, and Norman flinched, his breathing becoming more erratic. Without thinking, Andrea took his hand, her fingers wrapping firmly around his. Breathe with me. In through your nose, slowly, that's it. Now out through your mouth. She continued guiding his breathing, maintaining steady eye contact as the storm raged outside. Gradually, his grip on her hand loosened, his breathing slowed, and color returned to his face. That's better, she said softly. Keep breathing. You're doing great. As his panic subsided, embarrassment took its place. He pulled his hand away, straightening his tie in a reflexive gesture. I apologize for this. You can go. I'm not leaving you alone during the storm, Andrea said firmly. Not when it clearly triggers something significant for you. The lights flickered ominously, then went out completely, plunging the office into gray dimness broken only by lightning flashes. In the sudden darkness, Norman's carefully constructed walls seemed to crumble further. It was storming like this the night my mother died, he said, his voice barely audible above the rain lashing the windows. I was 14. We were driving home from my piano recital A drunk driver crossed the median. My father walked away without a scratch. She died instantly. The pain in his voice made Andrea's heart ache. I'm so sorry, Norman. My father never spoke of her again. Had her piano moved to the penthouse and forbade me to play it. Said music was a distraction from what mattered. Business, success, the Harbrook legacy. He gave a bitter laugh. I haven't touched those keys in 28 years. Andrea remained quiet, sensing he needed to speak, perhaps for the first time, about the wound that had shaped him. Every time there's a storm like this, he continued, I'm back in that car, helpless, watching everything that mattered being taken away. Outside, lightning split the sky, followed immediately by a deafening thunderclap. The storm was directly overhead now. Norman's breathing quickened again. Without hesitation, Andrea reached for his hand once more. Come with me. What? Trust me, she said, pulling him gently to his feet. We're going to get through this together. She led him through the darkened penthouse to the living room, where the floor-to-ceiling windows displayed the full fury of the storm. Sit, she instructed, guiding him to the sofa facing the windows. Norman looked at her incredulously. You want me to watch the storm? I want you to face it, she said, settling beside him. After my father died, I had panic attacks too, but I learned that avoiding triggers only gives them more power. Lightning illuminated the room, and Andrea kept her hand firmly in his. When I was 10, she said, my father had a heart attack while I was home alone with him. I called 911, but by the time they arrived, he was gone. Norman's eyes, adjusting to the dimness, studied her face with new understanding. For years afterward, I couldn't be alone in a house. Every unexpected sound set me into panic. I thought I was going crazy until a therapist helped me understand what was happening. How did you overcome it? He asked. By realizing that my fear couldn't hurt me. By acknowledging the pain instead of burying it. She gestured to the storm outside. That's just weather, Norman. It can't bring back that night or change what happened, but fighting it is exhausting you. They sat in silence for a while, watching the storm together, their hands still joined. Each time thunder rolled, Andrea felt his grip tighten, but his breathing remained steady. My sister had a baby last year, Andrea said softly. During labor, there were complications. For a few terrifying minutes, we thought we might lose them both. She turned to face him. While we were waiting, this calm came over me. I realized that all we ever have is this moment. We can't control what comes next. We can only be present for it. Norman's eyes held hers in the dim light. Is that how you handle everything, with such acceptance? Not everything, she admitted. I struggle with plenty. My career falling apart. Having to start over. The way people look at me sometimes, like my size defines my worth. She shrugged. But the big things, life, death, storms, yes, I've learned to face those. Another flash of lightning illuminated the room, highlighting the curve of her cheek, the warmth in her eyes. Norman found himself studying her face as if seeing it for the first time. The intelligence in her gaze, the gentle strength in her features, the fullness of her lips. You're remarkable, Andrea Walker, he said quietly. Something shifted between them, the air suddenly charged with more than just the storm's electricity. Norman raised his free hand, his fingers hesitating just shy of touching her face. Andrea's heart raced as he leaned closer, the moment suspended between them like a held breath. His eyes asked a question she wasn't sure she could answer. Then, with perfect dramatic timing, the lights flickered back on, flooding the room with sudden brightness. They pulled apart, the intimate bubble broken. Norman cleared his throat, releasing her hand. Thank you, he said formally. For helping me through that. Of course, she replied, trying to ignore the lingering warmth where his fingers had held hers. That's what friends do. Is that what we are? Friends? His voice held genuine curiosity. Andrea stood, straightening her clothes with nervous hands. I'm not sure what we are, Mr. Harbrook. But I'm glad I was here today. The storm continued outside, but its power over the moment had dissipated. They both recognized that something fundamental had shifted between them. Boundaries crossed that couldn't be re-established. Vulnerabilities revealed that couldn't be hidden again. As Andrea prepared to leave, Norman walked her to the door, their usual employer-employee dynamic irretrievably altered. Andrea, he said as she stepped into the hallway. The gallery you worked for. Hamilton. I have some connections in the art world. Perhaps I could make some calls. The offer, though kind, sparked an unexpected flare of pride. "I appreciate that, but I need to find my own way back, on my own terms." He nodded, respecting her independence. "I understand, but the offer stands." "Thank you," she smiled. "For what it's worth, I think your mother would be proud of the man you've become, despite your father's influence." Something like wonder crossed his face at her words. "I'll see you next week?" "Yes," she confirmed. Same time. The elevator doors closed between them, but the connection that had formed during the storm remained, a gossamer thread linking two people who had glimpsed beneath each other's carefully constructed surfaces and found something unexpectedly compelling. The next morning, Andrea woke to 3 text messages from her sister, Jasmine. "Emergency. Ellie's prescription refill denied by insurance. Need $600 we don't have. Can you help? I wouldn't ask if it wasn't life or death, sis. Please call me when you wake up." Andrea's stomach nodded with familiar anxiety. Her niece Ellie's heart condition required expensive medication, and Jasmine's insurance constantly found reasons to deny coverage. As a single mother working 2 jobs, Jasmine was already stretched beyond breaking. Andrea checked her bank balance and winced. The cleaning jobs barely covered her rent and student loans. She had less than $200 in savings, nowhere near enough. She called Jasmine immediately. "I have some money, but not enough," she said, skipping the greeting. "Maybe we can split it? I can put $200 on my credit card. I've already maxed mine out," Jasmine said, her voice tight with stress. "The hospital financial office is closed until Monday, and she needs the medication today." "What about a payment plan with the pharmacy?" "Already tried. They won't do it for this medication." Jasmine's voice broke. "I don't know what to do, Andrea. She needs this to live." Andrea closed her eyes, thinking rapidly. "Let me make some calls. I'll figure something out, I promise." After hanging up, she scrolled through her contacts. Who could possibly lend her $400 on short notice? Most of her friends from the art world were struggling themselves after the gallery closures. Her finger hovered over Norman's contact information, which Mrs. Prescott had given her, in case of emergencies with the penthouse. This wasn't a penthouse emergency, but it was certainly a life-or-death situation. Pride warred with necessity. Norman had offered to help with her career, but this was different. This was asking for money, something she'd sworn never to do. And yet, for Ellie, before she could second-guess herself, Andrea dialed his number. It rang 3 times before his deep voice answered. "Harbrook." "Mr. Harbrook, it's Andrea Walker. I apologize for calling on a Saturday." A pause. "Andrea, is everything all right?" "Actually, no." She took a deep breath. "I have a family emergency. My niece has a serious heart condition, and her insurance is refusing to cover her medication. I wouldn't ask, but it's literally life-saving, and I'm short by $400. And the words tumbled out in a rush, her face burning with embarrassment. "Where are you?" he asked immediately. "At home, but text me your address. I'll be there in 30 minutes. Before she could respond, he had ended the call. Andrea stared at her phone in disbelief. She'd expected an electronic transfer at most, not a personal visit. 28 minutes later, a sleek, black Audi pulled up outside her modest apartment building. Norman stepped out, looking surprisingly casual in dark jeans and a gray sweater that softened his usual corporate appearance. Andrea met him at the building entrance, acutely aware of her weekend attire, leggings, an oversized sweater, and her hair pulled back in a simple ponytail. "You didn't have to come in person," she said. "I wanted to." He handed her an envelope. "There's $1,000 for the medication and any related expenses." Andrea stared at the envelope. "I can't accept this much. I only need $400 and I intend to pay you back. Consider it an advance on your salary then." His eyes took in the modest building behind her, and Andrea felt a sudden self-consciousness about the vast difference between their lives. "Would you like to come up?" she offered, surprising herself. "I was just making coffee." Norman hesitated, then nodded. "I'd like that." Her apartment was small, but filled with character. Walls adorned with art prints, bookshelves overflowing with art history volumes, and plants thriving on every available surface. It was the antithesis of his sterile penthouse, warm and lived in. "It's not much," she said, watching him take it all in. "It's wonderful," he replied with unexpected sincerity. "It feels like you." She busied herself in the tiny kitchen, uncomfortable with his presence in her personal space, yet strangely pleased by it too. "The print above your desk," he said, examining it closer. "Is that an original Basquiat?" Andrea laughed. "Hardly. It's a reproduction I found at a street fair. My expensive art education didn't translate to expensive art ownership." She handed him a mug of coffee, and their fingers brushed in the exchange. The same electricity from the storm night sparked between them. "Thank you," she said softly, "for helping my niece. It means more than I can express." "You helped me during the storm," he replied. "This is a small thing in comparison. Not to us it isn't." She gestured for him to sit at her small dining table. "Ellie, my niece was born with a congenital heart defect. My sister's insurance covers the basics, but fights every step beyond that. Jasmine works 2 jobs, but it's never quite enough." Norman's expression darkened. "Healthcare shouldn't be a luxury." "No, it shouldn't," Andrea agreed, surprised by his response. "But for too many people, it is." "Which pharmacy needs the payment?" he asked. "Eastside Community Pharmacy." "Why?" Norman pulled out his phone. "Because I sit on the board of Hamilton Medical Group, which owns that pharmacy chain. This insurance denial needs investigation." Andrea watched in amazement as he made a call, his authoritative business voice requesting specific information about insurance protocols and patient advocacy programs. Within minutes, he had not only arranged for Ellie's prescription to be filled immediately, but had initiated a review of the entire denial process. When he ended the call, Andrea was staring at him with new eyes. "You just changed their entire system." He shrugged. "I just pointed out legal vulnerabilities in their current practice. Corporations respond quickly to liability concerns. Still, you didn't have to do that." "Perhaps I wanted to," he said, his eyes meeting hers across the table. "Perhaps I'm tired of systems that value profit over people." Andrea's coffee sat cooling, forgotten. "That's not what I would have expected from the CEO of Harbrook Investments." A ghost of a smile crossed his face. "I contain multitudes, Ms. Walker." "Apparently so." She studied him, this man who seemed so different in her space than in his own. "Why did you really come here today, Norman? You could have transferred the money electronically." The directness of her question caught him off guard. He considered for a moment before answering. "After the storm, I couldn't stop thinking about our conversation, about being present for the moment." His eyes held hers. "I wanted to see where you live, to understand more about you beyond our brief interactions in my home." The honesty of his answer created a warmth in her chest. "And what have you learned?" "That you live your values. Your home is filled with art despite limited means. You prioritize your family's needs above your pride. You create beauty in small spaces." He gestured around her apartment. "Everything here tells a story about who you are." "And what about your home?" she asked. "What story does it tell?" Norman considered this, his expression thoughtful. "That I value acquisition over connection. That I surround myself with beautiful things but rarely see them anymore." He looked down at his coffee. "That somewhere along the way, I forgot how to create a home, rather than just a showcase." Andrea was struck by his self-awareness, so at odds with the cold businessman she'd first encountered. "It's not too late to change that story," she said softly. Their eyes met across the table, the air between them charged with unspoken possibility. Norman leaned forward slightly, his coffee forgotten. Her phone's shrill ring shattered the moment. Andrea jumped, checking the screen. "It's my sister. I should take this." Norman nodded, standing. "I should go. Let your sister know the pharmacy will have her prescription ready within the hour, fully covered." "Thank you," Andrea said, walking him to the door. "For everything." He paused in the doorway, looking down at her with an intensity that made her breath catch. "I'll see you Monday?" "Yes," she confirmed, "same time." As he walked away, Andrea couldn't ignore the growing complexity of her feelings for Norman Harbrook, a man whose world seemed galaxies away from hers, yet who had shown her glimpses of a soul far more aligned with her own than she could have imagined. Monday morning arrived with Norman sitting at his piano, fingers hovering above the keys without touching them. He hadn't played since his conversation with Andrea. But something had shifted within him. The sheet music, his mother's favorite Chopin nocturne, waited patiently, yellowed with age but still legible. His phone buzzed with a message from Magnus, his COO and right-hand man. Board presentation in 30. Where are you? Norman glanced at his watch, surprised by the time. He'd been sitting at the piano for nearly an hour, lost in memories. With a last look at the untouched keys, he closed the lid and headed for the shower. By the time Andrea arrived at the penthouse, Norman had left for his offices downtown. She found Mrs. Prescott arranging fresh flowers in the entryway. He was playing this morning, the housekeeper said without preamble. Playing? The piano, I heard him. Mrs. Prescott's eyes shimmered with unshed tears. Not a full piece, just a few notes, but it's the first time in all my years here. Andrea's heart tightened at the news. That's wonderful. Something's changing in him, Mrs. Prescott said. And Prescott continued, studying Andrea with knowing eyes. Since the storm. Since you. Andrea busied herself with her cleaning supplies, uncomfortable with the implication. I'm just doing my job, Mrs. Prescott. We both know it's more than that, dear. The older woman patted her arm. Whatever it is, I'm grateful. That piano has been silent for too long. As Andrea moved through the penthouse, she noticed subtle changes. The blinds were open wider, allowing more natural light. A book of poetry sat on the coffee table, with a bookmark partway through. Most significantly, the art had been rearranged, not haphazardly, but with purpose. The stark modern pieces from the office had been moved to less prominent positions, while the warmer, more emotive works now occupied central spaces. In the library, she discovered a small bronze sculpture had been moved from its glass case to sit directly on the desk, where it could be touched and appreciated up close, rather than merely observed from a distance. When she reached Norman's bedroom, a space she usually cleaned quickly and impersonally, she found something unexpected on the nightstand. A framed photograph she'd never seen before. A beautiful woman with Norman's eyes sat at the very piano that now occupied his living room. A young boy beside her on the bench, their hands on the keys together, both smiling with unguarded joy. His mother and him, before tragedy rewrote their story. Andrea touched the frame gently, overwhelmed by the intimacy of this glimpse into his past. The photograph's placement beside his bed spoke volumes about the internal shifts happening beneath his controlled exterior. Later that afternoon, as Andrea was organizing the kitchen, the elevator announced a visitor. Expecting Norman, she was surprised when a different man strode in, younger than Norman, impeccably dressed in a designer suit, with an air of casual confidence. "Hello there," he said, his appraising gaze taking in Andrea's curves with undisguised appreciation. "You must be the new cleaning service." "Andrea Walker," she confirmed, extending her hand professionally. "Magnus Wells, COO of Harbrook Investments." His handshake lingered a moment longer than necessary. "Norman asked me to drop off these files for his review." "I can take those for you," Andrea offered. "No rush," Magnus replied with an easy smile, setting the files on the counter. "I rarely get to visit the infamous penthouse. Norman guards his private space like a fortress." He leaned against the counter. "So, how long have you been working here?" "A few weeks." Andrea continued her work. Politely distant. "And already reorganizing his art collection? Impressive." Magnus's tone was casual, but his eyes were shrewd. "Norman mentioned your expertise." "Did he?" "Oh, yes. It's unusual for him to notice staff at all, let alone discuss them in meetings." Magnus studied her with renewed interest. "You must have made quite an impression." Before Andrea could respond, the elevator doors opened again, and Norman entered. He stopped short at the sight of Magnus leaning close to Andrea, his expression darkening. "Magnus, I wasn't expecting you to stay." "Just getting acquainted with your art expert," Magnus replied smoothly, straightening up. "She was about to give me a tour of your collection." "I was not," Andrea corrected firmly, moving away from Magnus. Norman's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "If you're done delivering the files, I have a call with Tokyo in 5 minutes." The dismissal was clear. Magnus raised an eyebrow but gathered his coat. "Of course. We still on for dinner with the Peterson group tomorrow?" "Yes. Now if you'll excuse me." Norman's tone left no room for further conversation. After Magnus departed, and awkward silence filled the kitchen. Andrea resumed her work, aware of Norman watching her. "I apologize for Magnus," he finally said. "He can be forward." "No apology necessary," she replied, not meeting his eyes. "I handle forward men in my line of work all the time." Something in her tone made Norman study her more carefully. Did he say something inappropriate? Nothing I couldn't handle. She glanced up, surprised by the protective edge in his voice. "He seemed more curious about why you were discussing me in meetings." Norman's expression shifted from concern to something like embarrassment. "The art collection. The board is considering a public exhibition of selected pieces for charity. I mentioned your curatorial background." "I see." Andrea wasn't entirely convinced, but she let it drop. "That's a wonderful idea, actually. Your collection could generate significant funds for the right cause." "That was my thought as well." Norman seemed relieved by the change of subject. "Perhaps you could provide some recommendations. As a consultant, of course, paid accordingly." The offer was tempting, a chance to work in her field again, even temporarily. But Andrea hesitated, aware of the complicated feelings already developing between them. "I'd need to think about it," she said carefully. "Mixing professional relationships can get complicated." Their eyes met, both acknowledging the unspoken current running beneath her words. The professional boundaries between them had already blurred beyond recognition. "Of course," Norman agreed, his voice lower. "Take your time." Later that evening, as Andrea was preparing to leave, Norman emerged from his office. "I have something to show you before you go." Curious, she followed him to a previously locked room she'd never entered. He opened the door to reveal a small, intimate space lined with sketches and paintings different from the museum-quality works in the rest of the penthouse. "My mother's studio," he explained quietly. "She was an artist, not famous, but talented. I've kept it exactly as she left it." Andrea stepped inside, overwhelmed by the privilege of entering this preserved sanctuary. The room held an energy unlike anywhere else in the penthouse, creative, warm, personal. Canvases in various stages of completion leaned against walls, brushes stood in jars as if recently used, and the scent of oil paint lingered faintly despite the years. "Norman, this is extraordinary." She moved carefully through the space, studying the work with reverent attention. "Her use of color is remarkable." She had genuine talent. "Yes, she did." Pride warmed his voice. "My father wanted to clear it out after the funeral. I refused, my first and only act of rebellion as a teenager." Andrea paused before a striking landscape that captured a summer storm breaking over mountains. Violent yet beautiful, chaotic yet balanced. "Is this why you collect art? To honor her?" "I started collecting to feel close to her," he admitted, coming to stand beside Andrea. "But somewhere along the way, it became about acquisition rather than connection. Until you reminded me to actually see the art again, not just own it." The intimacy of the moment, standing together in his mother's sacred space, created a palpable tension between them. Andrea turned to find him watching her, his eyes reflecting vulnerability she'd never imagined possible in Norman Harbrook. "Thank you," she said softly, "for sharing this with me." "I've never shown anyone this room," he confessed. "Not even Magnus or my father. Only Mrs. Prescott has been permitted to clean it." The significance of his gesture wasn't lost on Andrea. This wasn't just a room. It was his most closely guarded emotional sanctuary, the physical embodiment of his deepest wound and most precious memory. "Why me?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Norman took a step closer, his eyes never leaving hers. "Because you saw me during the storm. Not the CEO, not the Harbrook heir, just me." The air between them, charged with electricity that had nothing to do with weather. Andrea felt her heart racing as Norman's hand slowly rose to her face, his fingers gently tracing the curve of her cheek. "Andrea," he breathed, her name a question and answer both. This time, there was no power surge to interrupt them, no phone call to break the moment. Norman lowered his head, his lips meeting hers in a kiss that began tentatively but quickly deepened with weeks of suppressed longing. Andrea responded without hesitation, her arms sliding around his neck as his encircled her waist, pulling her curvy body against his tall frame. The kiss transformed, becoming hungry, desperate, a release of tension that had been building since that first encounter over the Monet painting. When they finally broke apart, both breathless, Norman rested his forehead against hers. "I've wanted to do that since the storm," he confessed. "I've wanted you to," she admitted, her hands still resting on his shoulders. Reality intruded as Andrea's phone chimed with a text from Jasmine. She reluctantly stepped back, breaking the intimate bubble. "I should go," she said, though everything in her wanted to stay. Norman nodded, understanding in his eyes. "Would you have dinner with me tomorrow? Not here. Somewhere public. A proper date." The word date hung between them, transforming what had been unspoken into something named and real. "Yes," Andrea replied, surprising herself with how certain she felt. "I'd like that." His smile, genuine and unguarded, transformed his face completely. "I'll take you up at 7. As Andrea rode the elevator down, she touched her lips, still feeling the press of his. What was she doing? Norman Harbrook lived in a world of wealth and privilege she could barely comprehend. She was a temporary cleaner with a derailed career and financial struggles. Whatever was developing between them seemed destined for heartbreak. And yet, the connection felt more authentic than anything she'd experienced before. He'd shared his most private sanctuary with her, revealed vulnerabilities no one else had seen. That had to mean something. Whether it was enough to bridge their different worlds remained to be seen. The following evening, Andrea stood before her modest closet, anxiety mounting as she contemplated her options. Nothing seemed appropriate for a date with a billionaire, especially since Norman hadn't mentioned where they were going. Her phone rang. "Jasmine." "I need fashion help," Andrea admitted without preamble. "I have a date." "A date with who?" Her sister's surprise was evident. Andrea hesitated. "Norman Harbrook." Silence. Then, "Norman Harbrook? Your billionaire boss? The one who helped with Ellie's medication? That Norman Harbrook?" "Yes, that one," Andrea confirmed, wincing at her sister's tone. "And before you say anything, I'm coming over," Jasmine interrupted. "Right now, with wine, and my black dress." 30 minutes later, Jasmine was rifling through Andrea's closet, while Ellie played contentedly on the living room floor. "So," Jasmine said, pulling out and rejecting another outfit, "exactly how long have you been falling for your employer?" "I'm not falling for him," Andrea protested weakly. "It's complicated." Jasmine raised an eyebrow. "The billionaire CEO with the art collection kissed you in his dead mother's private studio that no one else has seen. Complicated doesn't begin to cover it." "I know it sounds crazy," Andrea sighed. "And maybe it is. We're from completely different worlds." Different worlds didn't stop him from helping Ellie. Jasmine pointed out, softening. "Or noticing your art knowledge, or kissing you like you're something precious." She pulled out a deep teal wrap dress Andrea had splurged on for job interviews. "This, with your silver earrings, and those ankle boots you never wear because they're impractical." As Andrea changed, Jasmine watched her with concerned eyes. "Just be careful, sis. Men like that, they're used to getting what they want." "Norman's different," Andrea said, adjusting the dress around her curves. "At least I think he is." "I hope you're right." Jasmine helped zip her up. "Because you deserve someone who sees how amazing you are. Curves, smarts, stubbornness, and all." At precisely 7, Andrea's buzzer rang. Norman waited outside, looking devastating in a charcoal suit with no tie, a subtle departure from his usual corporate armor. His eyes widened appreciatively as she approached. "You look beautiful," he said, his gaze taking in her curves with undisguised admiration. "Thank you." She fought the urge to make a self-deprecating comment about her size, a habit she was trying to break. "You clean up pretty well yourself." His driver opened the car door, and Andrea slid into the luxurious interior, acutely aware of the vast disparity between this vehicle and the buses she typically took. "Where are we going?" she asked as they pulled away from her building. "There's a gallery opening in Chelsea," Norman replied. "The new exhibition includes several pieces from artists you mentioned admiring. I thought you might enjoy seeing them." Andrea's heart skipped. Not a flashy restaurant or exclusive club, but an art gallery, something meaningful to her. "That sounds perfect." The gallery was housed in a renovated industrial space, its high ceilings and exposed brick creating an ideal backdrop for the contemporary works on display. As they entered, Andrea felt a pang of nostalgia, mixed with longing. This had been her world before economic realities had forced her detour. Norman sensed her emotion. "Are you all right?" "Yes," she assured him. "It's just been a while since I've been to an opening as a guest rather than staff." "Andrea?" A voice called from across the room. "Andrea Walker, is that you?" A tall woman in designer glasses approached, her face lighting with recognition. "It is you. Where have you been hiding?" "Denise," Andrea greeted her former colleague with a warm hug. "I've been exploring other opportunities." Denise's eyes darted curiously to Norman. Andrea made the introduction, watching as Denise's expression shifted from friendly to calculated networking mode. "Mr. Harbrook, what an unexpected pleasure. Your reputation as a collector precedes you." "Norman, please," he corrected smoothly. "Andrea has been helping me reassess my collection recently. Her curatorial eye is exceptional." Pride warmed Andrea's chest at his public acknowledgement of her expertise. As they moved through the gallery, she found herself naturally falling into her element, discussing techniques and influences with Norman and other attendees who quickly recognized her knowledge. For his part, Norman seemed content to watch her shine, occasionally adding insights, but primarily creating space for her to demonstrate her expertise. Several gallery owners engaged her in earnest conversation, exchanging cards and mentions of upcoming projects. "Your girlfriend is quite the find," one collector murmured to Norman while Andrea was deep in conversation with the gallery owner. "Where did you discover her?" Norman's eyes never left Andrea. "She discovered me, actually. Showed me what I'd been missing." The evening progressed beautifully until they encountered a striking blonde woman whose smile didn't reach her cold eyes. "Norman, darling," she purred, air-kissing his cheek. "I didn't expect to see you at something so accessible." "Daphne," he acknowledged stiffly. "You remember my saying I was expanding my collection focus." Daphne Rosenberg's gaze shifted to Andrea, assessing her with a dismissiveness that made her intent clear. "And who's your friend?" "Andrea Walker," Norman replied, his hand finding the small of Andrea's back in a gesture that was both protective and possessive. "Art consultant and former curator at Hamilton Gallery." "How fascinating," Daphne said, her tone suggesting the opposite. Her eyes lingered on Andrea's curves, a smirk playing at her lips. "I didn't realize curators had become so diverse." The implication was clear, and Andrea felt heat rising to her face, not from embarrassment, but from anger. Before she could respond, Norman spoke. "Andrea's expertise has been invaluable in helping me develop a more authentic collection," he said, his voice carrying a warning edge. "She sees beyond surface appearances to the genuine value beneath, a rare quality in our circles, wouldn't you agree?" Daphne's smile tightened. "Absolutely. How refreshing." She glanced over her shoulder. "Oh, I see the Andersons just arrived. Mustache." As she walked away, Andrea released a breath she didn't realize she'd been holding. "Friend of yours?" "Daughter of my father's business partner," Norman explained, his hand still warm against her back. "She's been angling for a merger, both corporate and personal, for years." "I see." Andrea tried to ignore the stab of insecurity. Daphne was exactly the type of woman she'd expect to see on Norman's arm. Wealthy, thin, socially connected. Norman turned to face her fully, his eyes serious. "No, I don't think you do. Daphne represents everything I've grown tired of. People who value appearance over substance, who collect relationships like art pieces without ever truly seeing them." His honesty disarmed her. "And what you see when you look at me, Norman?" "Someone real," he said simply. "Someone who challenged me when I needed challenging. Someone who saw me during a storm." The gallery's ambient noise seemed to fade as they looked at each other, the connection between them palpable. Norman glanced around at the crowded space. "Would you mind if we left? There's somewhere else I'd like to take you." In the car, Andrea expected them to head to an upscale restaurant. Instead, Norman directed his driver to a small park overlooking the river. At this hour, it was nearly deserted, the city lights reflecting on the water's surface like fallen stars. "I come here sometimes to think," Norman said as they walked along the riverside path. "When the office and the penthouse feel too confining." "It's beautiful," Andrea agreed. breathing in the night air. I wouldn't have pegged you for a park person. There's a lot you don't know about me yet. He took her hand, his fingers intertwining with hers. I'd like to change that. They found a bench overlooking the water, and Norman pulled her closer against the evening chill. The intimacy of the moment, away from the art world, away from his penthouse, just two people, beneath the same stars, felt significant. Tell me something no one else knows about you, Andrea prompted, resting her head against his shoulder. Norman was quiet for a moment. I hate being a Harbrook, he finally said. The name, the legacy, the expectations, all of it. If I could walk away tomorrow and just be Norman, I would. What would just Norman do? Travel, read poetry instead of financial reports, play the piano again. He turned to look at her. Get to know a certain art curator without the complications of being her employer. Andrea smiled. I think I'd like just Norman. You're the only person who's ever met him, he said softly. When he kissed her this time, it was unhurried and deep. A different kind of hunger than their first kiss. Less desperate, more intentional. Andrea melted against him, her body responding to his touch with an intensity that surprised her. When they finally broke apart, both breathless, Norman rested his forehead against hers. Come home with me, he whispered, his voice rough with desire. The invitation hung between them, weighted with possibilities and complications. Andrea knew crossing this line would change everything. The professional boundaries were already blurred beyond recognition, but this would erase them completely. Yes, she said, making her decision. Take me home. The ride back to his penthouse was charged with anticipation, their hands entwined on the seat between them, occasional glances exchanging promises of what was to come. When they entered the penthouse, it felt different than when she arrived as his cleaner. The space transformed by their new relationship, by the knowledge of what they were about to share. Norman poured them each a glass of wine, his movements deliberate, giving her time to change her mind if she wished. But Andrea had never been more certain. She moved to the windows, looking out at the city lights spread below them like a carpet of stars. She felt rather than heard him approach, his presence warming her back moments before his hands gently settled on her shoulders. Second thoughts? He asked, his breath warm against her ear. Andrea turned in his arms, looking up into his eyes. Not one. The kiss that followed broke the last restraints between them. Norman's hands traced the curves of her body with reverent appreciation, not a hint of hesitation or judgment about her size. His touch made her feel beautiful, desired, not despite her curves but because of them, because they were part of who she was. When he finally lifted her into his arms, carrying her toward the bedroom, Andrea felt none of the self-consciousness that had plagued previous relationships. Norman's eyes held nothing but desire, and something deeper, more profound than physical attraction alone. In his bedroom, now lit only by the city lights filtering through the windows, Norman laid her gently on his bed. As clothing gave way to skin, their bodies learning each other with increasing urgency, Andrea felt walls crumbling within her that she hadn't even realized she'd built. Defenses against judgment, against rejection, against being wanted for anything less than her complete self. Norman worshipped her body with a thoroughness that left her breathless, his hands and lips exploring every curve and valley, as if memorizing a masterpiece. You're beautiful, he murmured against her skin. So beautiful. When they finally came together, the union was more than physical. It was a surrender of pretenses, of the masks they'd both worn for too long. In Norman's arms, Andrea found acceptance she'd never expected. In hers, he found a tenderness he'd forgotten could exist. Their passion built like a symphony, each movement more intense than the last, until they crested together in a moment of perfect harmony. Names gasped like prayers in the darkness. Afterward, as they lay tangled in sheets and each other, Norman traced lazy patterns on the curve of her hip, his expression more peaceful than she'd ever seen it. "What are you thinking?" she asked, brushing silver-streaked hair from his forehead. "That for the first time in my life, I'm exactly where I want to be." His eyes met hers, Vulnerability and certainty mingled in their blue depths. With exactly who I want to be with. Andrea knew the real world waited beyond this moment. Her cleaning schedule, his corporate empire, the vast differences in their circumstances. But for now, in the sanctuary they'd created together, none of that seemed to matter. She curled closer into his embrace, her head resting on his chest where she could hear the steady beat of his heart. Whatever complications tomorrow might bring. Tonight had been a transformation for them both, a recognition that beneath titles and appearances, they had found something genuine in each other, something worth protecting and exploring. "Sleep," Norman murmured, pressing a kiss to her forehead. "I'll be here when you wake." And for the first time in years, both of them slept without nightmares or restlessness, held in the safety of newfound connection. Morning light filtered through the floor-to-ceiling windows, painting golden stripes across the bed where Andrea lay curled against Norman's side. She stirred first, momentarily disoriented by the unfamiliar surroundings, before memories of the night before brought a smile to her lips. Norman slept peacefully beside her, his face relaxed in a way she'd never seen during waking hours. The perpetual furrow between his brows smoothed away, his mouth softened. He looked younger, unburdened by the Harbrook legacy and corporate responsibilities. Careful not to wake him, Andrea slipped from the bed, wrapping herself in his discarded shirt. It hung large on her frame, but the lingering scent of his cologne provided a comforting intimacy as she padded barefoot through the penthouse that she'd previously only experienced as an employee. In the kitchen, she found coffee and set about making breakfast, moving with quiet familiarity through a space she knew from cleaning but was now experiencing from an entirely different perspective. The domesticity of the moment wasn't lost on her, how quickly their relationship had transformed from employer-employee to something far more intimate. As she reached for mugs from the cabinet, her gaze fell on Norman's briefcase on the counter, partially open with documents visible inside. She wouldn't have looked twice. Except for a familiar name that caught her eye, East Side Community Center. The community center was in Jasmine's neighborhood, a vital resource for local families that provided after-school programs, health services, and art classes for children who couldn't afford them. Ellie had taken her first art class there. Without intending to snoop, Andrea's eyes scanned the visible portion of the document, Acquisition and Redevelopment Proposal, East Side Property Holdings. Her stomach clenched as she read further. Recommend immediate acquisition of properties, including the community center, for luxury condominium development, projecting 300% ROI within 5 years. Good morning. Andrea startled at Norman's voice, nearly dropping the mugs. He stood in the doorway, wearing only pajama bottoms, his hair tousled from sleep, a soft smile on his face that faded as he registered her expression. "What's wrong?" he asked, moving closer. Andrea gestured to the briefcase. "Are you planning to demolish the East Side Community Center?" Norman's expression shifted, corporate mask sliding back into place. "Those are confidential business documents." "That wasn't my question." Andrea set the mugs down with deliberate care. "That center is vital to my sister's neighborhood. It provides essential services to families who have nowhere else to go." Norman closed the briefcase, his jaw tightening. "It's a complex business situation, Andrea. The area is undergoing natural redevelopment." Natural? She couldn't keep the edge from her voice. There's nothing natural about forcing out low-income families so luxury condos can be built. No one's being forced out. We're offering fair market value. Fair market value doesn't help when there's nowhere affordable left to go. Andrea pulled Norman's shirt tighter around herself, suddenly conscious of her vulnerability. "Do you have any idea what that center means to the community? To children like Ellie?" Norman's expression hardened. "This is exactly why I don't discuss business at home. You're oversimplifying a complex economic decision. And you're reducing people's lives to numbers on a spreadsheet." The disappointment in her voice was palpable. "I thought, after everything, after seeing how you helped with Ellie's medication, that you understood the real impact of these business decisions on actual lives." "That was different," Norman argued. That was one family, one situation I could personally address. And this affects hundreds of families, Andrea countered. Does the scale make them less deserving of consideration? They stood facing each other across the kitchen island, the intimacy of the previous night suddenly replaced by the stark reality of their different worlds and values. I need to get dressed, Andrea said finally, turning away. I should go home. Andrea, wait. Norman moved around the island, reaching for her hand. Let's talk about this. She paused, looking up at him with eyes that reflected both disappointment and challenge. Are you willing to reconsider the development? The question hung between them, a test neither had anticipated facing so soon. Norman's silence was answer enough. In the bedroom, Andrea dressed quickly, her mind racing. How could she have been so naive? Norman Harbrook was still the CEO of a corporate empire built on maximizing profit. One night of connection, no matter how profound, couldn't change that fundamental reality. When she emerged, Norman was waiting in the living room, now dressed in casual weekend clothes, his expression troubled. I've called my driver to take you home, he said, unless you'd prefer a taxi. Your driver is fine, she replied, her voice carefully neutral. The professional walls she'd constructed over years of working for wealthy clients were reassembling themselves, brick by emotional brick. Andrea, Norman began, business decisions aren't black and white. There are shareholders, board members, economic realities. I understand economics, Norman. Her tone was measured but firm. What I don't understand is how the man who held me last night, who shared his mother's sacred space with me, who seemed to value authenticity and connection, can be the same man who would displace an entire community for a 300% return on investment. Norman flinched as if she'd struck him. That's not fair. Isn't it? She gathered her purse, maintaining her composure with effort. Perhaps we both got caught up in a fantasy last night, me thinking you were more than your corporate identity, you thinking I was a diversion from it. That's not what last night was, Norman insisted, genuine hurt flashing in his eyes. What I feel for you is real. Andrea softened slightly. I believe you. But it doesn't change this fundamental disconnect in our values. The elevator chimed its arrival. I need some time to think. Will I see you on Monday? The vulnerability in his question caught her off guard. I don't know, she admitted. I need to figure out if I can separate the man I'm falling for from the businessman whose decisions hurt people I care about. As the elevator doors closed between them, Andrea leaned against the wall, emotional exhaustion washing over her. The fantasy of their connection had collided with reality sooner and more painfully than she'd anticipated. Monday morning found Andrea standing outside Harbrook Tower, conflicted about whether to enter. She'd spent the weekend in turmoil, alternating between replaying the intimacy they'd shared and wrestling with the moral implications of the development plans. Jasmine had been blunt when Andrea confided in her. Men like that don't change their entire value system for a relationship, no matter how special. The question is whether you can accept him as he is. Could she? The tenderness Norman had shown her, the vulnerability he'd revealed, the genuine connection they'd formed, all of it felt real and precious. But so did her convictions about community responsibility and ethical business practices. Taking a deep breath, Andrea entered the building. Whatever happened next, she owed it to both of them to have an honest conversation. When she reached the penthouse, Mrs. Prescott greeted her with obvious relief. Thank goodness you're here. He's been impossible all weekend. Is he home? Andrea asked, removing her coat. In his studio. Mrs. Prescott's use of the word studio rather than office wasn't lost on Andrea. He hasn't left since yesterday afternoon. Andrea moved through the penthouse, her heart pounding as she approached the door to what had once been his mother's studio. She knocked softly. I said I didn't want to be disturbed, Norman's voice called, tension evident in every syllable. It's me. Andrea replied. Silence, then footsteps. The door opened to reveal Norman, looking uncharacteristically disheveled. Unshaven, silver-streaked hair uncombed, his usual impeccable clothing replaced by a simple black t-shirt and jeans. Behind him, Andrea could see the studio had been transformed. The dust covers had been removed from his mother's canvases, art supplies arranged as if recently used. On an easel sat a half-finished painting. Not his mother's, but something new. You're painting, she said, surprised. Trying to. He stepped back, allowing her to enter. not very successfully. The canvas showed an abstract landscape, storm clouds gathering over mountains reminiscent of his mother's work, but with a heavier hand, more turbulent energy. It wasn't technically accomplished, but it conveyed powerful emotion. "It's honest," Andrea said, studying it. "Raw, but truthful." Norman watched her cautiously, as if expecting judgment beyond the artwork. "I thought you might not come back." "I almost didn't." She turned to face him. "The community center project is being reconsidered," he interrupted. "I spent yesterday in meetings with the development team exploring alternative approaches." Andrea blinked in surprise. "What kind of alternatives?" "Mixed-use development that would incorporate the existing community center with expanded facilities. Subsidized housing units alongside market-rate ones, retention of the current staff with additional positions created." He ran a hand through his already disheveled hair. "It's more complicated, less immediately profitable, but potentially more sustainable long-term." "What made you change your approach?" she asked, hardly daring to hope it had been their argument. Norman gestured to the painting. "I couldn't sleep after you left. Kept thinking about what my mother would say about the kind of man I've become. She was passionate about art education for everyone, not just the privileged. The community center reminded me of programs she used to volunteer with." He moved to the window, looking out at the city sprawled below. "I started painting to reconnect with that part of myself. The part that existed before profit margins and shareholder value became my entire identity." Andrea approached slowly, standing beside him at the window. "And what did you find?" "That I've lost more than I realized." His voice was quiet, reflective. "When my mother died, my father stepped in to reshape me in his image. Cold, calculating, successful at all costs. And I let him, because it was easier than feeling the pain." He turned to her, vulnerability evident in his eyes. "Then you came along and started rearranging more than just my art collection." The honesty of his admission touched something deep within Andrea. She reached for his hand, their fingers intertwining naturally. "The new development approach isn't just for you," he continued. "It makes business sense too. Sustainable community investment, positive PR, tax incentives. But I wouldn't have seen those possibilities if you hadn't forced me to look beyond the standard profit model." "So we're both right," Andrea said with a small smile. "It's not black and white." "No," he agreed, drawing her closer. "It's a masterpiece in progress, with all the complexity that entails." Their kiss was gentle, a reconnection after conflict that felt more meaningful than their passionate encounters before. This wasn't just physical attraction or emotional intimacy. It was a meeting of minds and values, the beginning of a true partnership. Later that morning, as Andrea worked and Norman took calls in his office, Magnus arrived unannounced. Finding Andrea arranging flowers in the entryway, he raised an eyebrow. "Still here, I see," he observed. "Norvin's in his office?" "Yes, on a call with the development team about East Side," she replied. Magnus's expression registered surprise. "He's restructuring that deal? The board won't be pleased." "Sometimes leadership means making unpopular decisions for the right reasons," Andrea said, meeting his gaze steadily. Magnus studied her with new consideration. "You're the reason for the change of direction." It wasn't a question, but Andrea answered anyway. "I simply provided a different perspective. Norman made his own decision." "Interesting." Magnus leaned against the wall, his casual posture belied by the sharpness in his eyes. "You should know something about Norman, since you're clearly becoming important to him." Andrea waited, wary of his tone. "His last serious relationship ended badly," Magnus continued. "Veronica Prescott, no relation to the housekeeper. Beautiful, socially connected, seemingly perfect. They were engaged for 8 months. "What happened?" Andrea asked, despite herself. Norman overheard her on the phone with a friend, discussing how she'd secured herself a Harbrook and would never have to work again. Magnus's expression hardened. She hadn't counted on prenuptial agreements or background checks. Turned out she had quite a history of attaching herself to wealthy men. "Why are you telling me this?" Andrea asked, though she suspected the answer. "Because Norman doesn't trust easily, and he's never brought a woman to the penthouse before you. Certainly not someone from such a different background." Magnus's implication was clear. His judgment might be compromised where you're concerned. Andrea set down the flowers with deliberate care. Mr. Wells, let me be very clear. I have never asked Norman for money or favors. When I needed help for my niece, it was the hardest call I've ever made. I was a respected curator before economic circumstances forced a career change, and I will be again, with or without Norman's connections. She straightened to her full height, her curves carried with dignity. I care about Norman as a person, not a bank account. If you're genuinely his friend, you'll recognize that what he needs isn't another yes man or social climber, but someone who sees him beyond the Harbrook name. Magnus held her gaze for a long moment before his expression shifted subtly. You know, I might have misjudged you, Andrea Walker. Most people do, she replied evenly. The office door opened, and Norman emerged, stopping short at the sight of them in what appeared to be a standoff. Everything all right? He asked, looking between them. Just getting acquainted, Magnus replied smoothly. Andrea was explaining her perspective on the East Side development. And what do you think of her approach? Norman asked, moving to stand beside Andrea in a subtle show of support. Magnus considered them both before answering. I think it has merit. Unconventional, but potentially valuable. The board will need convincing, though. I'm prepared for that, Norman assured him. After Magnus left for their meeting, Norman turned to Andrea. What was that really about? He was warning me not to break your heart, she summarized, and making sure I wasn't another Veronica. Norman stiffened. He told you about her. Only the basics. I'm sorry she hurt you. It was a long time ago. Norman's expression softened as he looked at her. And nothing like what's happening between us. No, Andrea agreed. This is different. And it was. Their connection had been built on seeing each other's true selves from the beginning. Flaws and vulnerabilities included. There were no illusions to shatter. Only truths to discover. Andrea continued cleaning the penthouse on scheduled days, a professional boundary they maintained despite their personal involvement, but spent many evenings and weekends there as Norman's guest. The penthouse itself began to transform under her influence. Art was rearranged to create conversation spaces rather than formal displays. Books migrated from shelves to side tables, actually read rather than merely collected. Fresh flowers appeared in rooms that had previously been sterile showcases of wealth. Most significantly, the piano in the living room showed signs of regular use. Sheet music arranged on the stand. The bench position adjusted frequently. Though Norman never played when anyone else was present, Andrea sometimes arrived to hear the final notes of a piece fading as she entered. Their worlds began to cautiously intermingle. Norman met Jasmine and Ellie over dinner at Andrea's apartment, impressing her sister by sitting on the floor to play games with her niece, instead of maintaining his usual corporate distance. He's really trying, Jasmine admitted later, after Norman had left. I didn't expect that. Neither did I, Andrea confessed. He's different from who I thought he was when we met. The question is, Jasmine said, giving her a searching look, is he different enough? Your world are still miles apart, sis. It was a question Andrea had been asking herself. Despite their growing connection, stark reminders of their different circumstances appeared regularly. Society columnists had begun speculating about Norman's mystery woman after they were photographed at the gallery opening. The coverage inevitably focused on Andrea's size and background, questioning what the billionaire CEO saw in the curvy former art curator. Norman was furious at the coverage, but Andrea tried to maintain perspective. It says more about them than us, she told him, though the comments stung more than she let on. The real test of their relationship came when Norman invited Andrea to accompany him to a charity gala, a high-profile event where the city's elite would be watching their every move. You don't have to say yes, he assured her. These events are tedious at best, excruciating at worst. Will your father be there? Andrea asked. Norman had spoken little about Richard Harbrook, but his influence loomed large in Norman's life. Yes, Norman admitted. It would be our first public appearance together, and my father's first time meeting you. The significance wasn't lost on either of them. This wouldn't be just a date. It would be a statement about their relationship. A declaration that Norman was serious about someone so outside his usual social circle. I'll go, Andrea decided, but I have nothing to wear to something like that. Norman smiled, clearly relieved by her acceptance. Leave that to me. 2 days later, a delivery arrived at Andrea's apartment. Not the designer dress she'd half expected, but something far more meaningful. Inside an elegant box was a handwritten note in Norman's precise script. For the gallery fundraiser next month, but perhaps perfect for the gala as well. Your vision for this community project deserves recognition, and I'm proud to stand beside you as it becomes reality. Beneath the note lay an official letter confirming Andrea's appointment as Director of Community Engagement for the new Eastside Arts Initiative, a position that would utilize her curatorial experience to develop art education programs in the redeveloped community center. Also in the box was a business card with her name and new title, along with information about a bank account established for her professional expenses, including an appropriate wardrobe for her new role. Andrea stared at the contents, emotions conflicting. The position was perfect, exactly the kind of meaningful work she'd been missing. But the way it had been presented, alongside funds for clothing, raised uncomfortable questions about power and independence. When Norman called that evening, she struggled to articulate her mixed feelings. "The position is incredible," she began carefully, "and I'm deeply grateful. But you're concerned about the appearance of impropriety," Norman finished for her. "That I created a job for my girlfriend and am now dressing her for public consumption." "Something like that," Andrea admitted. "I want to earn my opportunities, Norman." "You have," he insisted. Magnus interviewed 3 other candidates with similar backgrounds. All agreed you were the most qualified. As for the clothing budget, it's a standard part of the position. Community engagement means representing the initiative at functions where appropriate attire is required. His explanation made sense, but a lingering discomfort remained. "I need to know that what's happening between us is separate from professional opportunities, that I'm not just a project for you to fix." Norman was quiet for a moment. "Do you remember what you said to me about the Monet painting the day we met? About how it needed proper alignment to achieve its intended effect?" "Yes," she said, uncertain where he was going. "That's what you've done for me, Andrea. You haven't changed who I am. You've simply helped me find better alignment with who I was meant to be." His voice softened. "I'm not trying to fix you. I'm trying to build something meaningful with you, personally and professionally." The sincerity in his voice dispelled her doubts. "Then I accept both the position and the gala invitation." "Good," he said, relief evident, "because Magnus already announced your appointment to the board. And I've already told my father I'm bringing you to the gala." "You were that confident I'd say yes?" she asked, amused despite herself. "Not at all," he admitted. "But I've learned from you that some risks are worth taking." The night of the gala arrived, with a mixture of anticipation and anxiety. Andrea had chosen a gown that complemented rather than concealed her curves, a deep sapphire blue that reminded her of Norman's eyes, with architectural details that flattered her figure and spoke to her artistic sensibilities. Jasmine helped with her hair and makeup, creating an elegant look that felt both special and authentic. "You look like royalty," her sister declared. "Curvy, gorgeous, confident royalty." "I don't feel confident," Andrea admitted. "I'll be walking into a room full of people who think I don't belong there." "Then show them exactly why you do," Jasmine replied, squeezing her hand. "Show them the woman Norman sees." When Norman arrived to pick her up, his reaction was everything Andrea could have hoped for. He stood speechless in her doorway, his eyes taking in every detail with unconcealed admiration. "You are breathtaking," he finally said, his voice husky with emotion. For the first time, Andrea fully believed the compliment, seeing herself through his eyes rather than society's critical gaze. "You clean up pretty well yourself," she teased, admiring his perfectly tailored tuxedo. In the car, Norman took her hand, his expression growing serious. "My father will likely be difficult tonight. He values appearances above all else." "I can handle difficult people," Andrea assured him, though butterflies danced in her stomach. "I know you can," he squeezed her hand. "Just remember that his opinion means nothing to me anymore." The gala was being held at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, its grand staircase illuminated with thousands of tiny lights. As they ascended the steps, Andrea felt the weight of scrutiny from the crowd. Curious glances, whispered comments, assessing looks that measured her worth based on her appearance. Norman's hand remained firmly at the small of her back, a silent declaration of his support. Inside, the museum's grand hall had been transformed into an opulent reception space, with New York's elite mingling among priceless artifacts. "Norman?" a cultured voice called, and they turned to find Magnus approaching with a distinguished older couple. The Whitmores were just asking about the East Side Initiative. Introductions were made, and Andrea found herself drawn into a discussion about community art programs. To her surprise, Mrs. Whitmore revealed she had visited the Hamilton Gallery during Andrea's tenure there. "Your curation of emerging artists was exceptional," she said warmly. "Such an eye for undiscovered talent." "Thank you," Andrea replied, genuinely touched by the recognition. "That's exactly the spirit we hope to bring to the East Side program, finding and nurturing talent that might otherwise go unnoticed." As the evening progressed, Andrea found her confidence growing. Her knowledge of art and genuine passion for community engagement drew interest from potential donors, many of whom seemed to forget their initial skepticism about her presence as they engaged with her ideas. Norman watched her with undisguised pride, occasionally joining conversations, but mostly creating space for her to shine on her own merits. They had just finished speaking with the foundation director when Norman stiffened beside her. "My father," he murmured, as an older man with Norman's height, but none of his warmth approached. Richard Harbrook moved with the confidence of someone accustomed to commanding rooms. His silver hair was immaculately styled, his tuxedo clearly bespoke, his expression coldly assessing as his gaze fell on Andrea. "Norman," he acknowledged, before turning to Andrea. "And you must be Miss Walker. I've heard quite a bit about you." "Mr. Harbrook," Andrea greeted him with poised confidence. "It's a pleasure to finally meet you." "Indeed." His tone suggested otherwise. "I understand you've had quite an influence on my son recently." "The East Side Project, the community art initiative." He smiled thinly. "Quite a departure from our usual investment strategies." "A profitable departure," Norman interjected smoothly. "The mixed-use approach has already generated positive press and attracted new investors interested in sustainable development." "Yes, well, novelty often attracts attention initially," Richard dismissed. "The question is whether it's sustainable long-term." "That's precisely our focus," Andrea said, meeting his gaze steadily. "Creating value that extends beyond quarterly reports, though those numbers are quite promising as well." Richard's eyebrows rose slightly. "You're familiar with the financials?" "Andrea has been instrumental in developing the entire initiative," Norman explained, "including the business model." "How surprising." Richard's gaze swept over Andrea's curves with poorly disguised judgment. "Your background is in art, I believe, not finance?" "Art curation requires more business acumen than most realize," Andrea replied evenly. "Valuation, market trends, investment potential, audience development. Not so different from what you do, just with different assets." A flicker of surprise crossed Richard's face before his mask of cool assessment returned. "An interesting perspective, though I wonder if personal relationships might be clouding professional judgment in this case." The implication was clear, and Andrea felt Norman tense beside her. "Actually," she responded before Norman could, "I believe personal relationships can enhance professional judgment when they're built on mutual respect and shared values. Norman and I challenge each other to see beyond our individual perspectives. That's valuable in business and in life." Richard studied her with new consideration. "You're not what I expected, Miss Walker." "I rarely am, Mr. Harbrook," she replied with a small smile. Before the conversation could continue, Daphne Rosenberg appeared, inserting herself between Norman and his father with practiced social grace. "Richard, darling," she purred, air-kissing his cheek. "You promised to introduce me to the senator." She turned to Norman with a predatory smile. "Norman, you're looking devastating as always." Her gaze finally landed on Andrea, taking in her curves with poorly concealed disdain. "And, Andrea, was it? How nice to see you again. That color is so brave for your figure." The barb was delivered with such practiced sweetness that responding would have seemed defensive. Andrea simply smiled, refusing to engage with the pettiness. "Daphne," Norman acknowledged coolly, "if you'll excuse us, Andrea and I were about to view the new exhibition." As they moved away, Norman's hand tightened around Andrea's. "I'm sorry about that." "Don't be," she replied. "I've dealt with Daphne's my entire life. At least yours is obvious about her disdain." They found a quieter space in one of the galleries, momentarily alone among ancient artifacts. Norman turned to her, his expression troubled. "My father will never accept us," he said quietly. "He sees relationships as strategic alliances, nothing more." "Is that what you want?" Andrea asked. "His acceptance?" Norman considered the question. "I thought I did. For most of my life. I've sought his approval in everything. But now," he took both her hands in his, "now I find I care far more about your happiness than his opinion." The admission clearly cost him something, a final breaking away from patterns established in childhood. Andrea squeezed his hands, recognizing the significance of the moment. "Then we're doing fine," she assured him, "because being with you, watching you reconnect with the man you were meant to be, that makes me very happy." Norman's kiss was gentle, but filled with promise. A public declaration in the private moment they'd carved out of the evening. When they returned to the gala, something had shifted between them. A deeper commitment, an acknowledgement that they were choosing each other despite the complications. As they mingled through the remainder of the evening, Andrea became aware of photographers documenting the event, several focusing particular attention on them. The public scrutiny was uncomfortable but inevitable, given Norman's profile. "Tomorrow's society pages will be interesting," she murmured as they finally prepared to leave. "Does that worry you?" Norman asked, helping her with her wrap. Andrea considered the question honestly. "A little," she admitted, "but not enough to change anything about tonight." In the car heading home, Norman seemed preoccupied, his brow furrowed in thought. When they reached her apartment building, he turned to her with unexpected seriousness. "Stay with me tonight," he said, his voice low and intense. "At the penthouse?" she clarified. "Yes." His eyes held hers in the dim light. "I don't want to be apart from you tonight." The invitation wasn't just about physical intimacy. It was about facing whatever public reaction would come their way together, about solidifying their union before the world weighed in on its validity. "Yes," Andrea agreed, her decision made without reservation. "Let's go home." The word home lingered between them, its meaning expanding beyond physical space to encompass the connection they built, a sanctuary of mutual understanding in a world that seemed determined to misunderstand them both. The morning headlines were worse than either of them had anticipated. Andrea woke in Norman's bed to the sound of his voice, tense with anger, coming from the living room. Wrapping herself in his robe, she followed the sound to find him pacing, phone pressed to his ear. "I don't care what the legal department says," he was saying, his free hand clenched in a fist. "I want a retraction and an apology, or we'll pursue every available remedy." He looked up as Andrea entered, his expression softening momentarily before he gestured to a tablet on the coffee table. "I'll call you back," he told the person on the other end, ending the call. Andrea picked up the tablet to find a society blog open to an article with the inflammatory headline, "Harbrook Heirs Plus-Size Plaything. Art World Failure Uses Curves to Climb Corporate Ladder." The accompanying photos showed them at the gala, carefully selected angles, making Andrea appear larger than she was, while the text speculated crudely about what Norman could possibly see in the overweight former curator, beyond a physical dalliance. "It's disgusting," Norman said, voice tight with controlled fury. "They'll be retracting it within the hour." Andrea set down the tablet, her stomach churning but her voice steady. "It's not the first time I've been reduced to my size, Norman. It probably won't be the last." "That doesn't make it acceptable," he argued, coming to stand before her. "They have no right to speak about you that way." "No, they don't," she agreed. "But getting angry only gives them what they want, proof that they've struck a nerve." She took his hands, forcing calm into her voice despite the hurt churning inside. "This is why I've avoided the spotlight. People like me are rarely afforded dignity in it." Norman's anger shifted to concern. "I've exposed you to this. I'm sorry. You haven't exposed me to anything I wasn't already aware of, she assured him. I knew what I was walking into. His phone buzzed again, Magnus, according to the screen. Norman silenced it, focusing entirely on her. How are you really feeling about this? Andrea considered deflecting with practiced bravery, but their relationship deserved honesty. Hurt, she admitted. Angry. Reminded of every time I've been judged based on my appearance rather than my abilities. But also determined not to let it matter. Norman pulled her into his arms, holding her against his chest where she could hear the steady beat of his heart. It doesn't matter, he murmured into her hair. None of it matters. But as the day progressed, it became clear that, in the court of public opinion, it did matter. By afternoon, the story had spread beyond society blogs to mainstream outlets, with business publications questioning Norman's judgment and stability. The Harbrook investment stock price took a minor but noticeable dip as investors reacted to the unexpected personal development. Magnus arrived at the penthouse with a crisis management team, his expression grave. The board is calling an emergency meeting, he informed Norman. Your father's leading the charge. Andrea, who had been working quietly in the guest room on East Side Initiative plans, emerged at the sound of raised voices. This is exactly why I warned you about going public, Magnus was saying. Personal relationships should be kept private until properly vetted and managed. Vetted and managed? Norman repeated incredulously. This isn't a merger, Magnus. It's my life. Magnus noticed Andrea and had the grace to look uncomfortable. Andrea, I apologize. This isn't personal. It feels extremely personal, she replied calmly, moving to stand beside Norman. What exactly is the board concerned about? Public perception, Magnus explained, professional mask firmly in place. Harbrook Investments manages billions in assets. Client confidence is built on a perception of stability and sound judgment. And my relationship with Andrea threatens that perception? Norman's voice was dangerously quiet. Magnus chose his words carefully. The unexpected nature of the relationship, combined with the timing of the East Side Initiative changes and your recent, unconventional management decisions, has created concerns about outside influence. The implication hung in the air, as offensive as the tabloid headlines, but dressed in corporate language. I see, Norman said coldly. So if Andrea were a society debutante with the right connections and appearance, there would be no concerns about outside influence, regardless of her qualifications? Magnus had the decency to look uncomfortable. I'm just conveying the board's position, Norman. Personally, I've come to respect Andrea's insights. He turned to her directly. You might consider stepping back from the East Side position temporarily until this blows over. It would help address the perception issues. Andrea felt Norman tense beside her, ready to refuse on her behalf, but she placed a gentle hand on his arm. Thank you for your candor, Magnus. I'll consider what's best for the initiative. After Magnus left, Norman turned to her incredulously. You're not seriously considering stepping down? I'm considering all options, she replied, mind working rapidly. Including what's best for the community this initiative is meant to serve. If my presence jeopardizes funding or support, no. Norman's voice was firm. I won't let them force you out of a position you've earned because they're uncomfortable with who I choose to love. The word love hung between them, spoken for the first time in the heat of the moment. Norman seemed as surprised by it as Andrea, but he didn't retract it. Did you mean that? She asked quietly. Yes, he said without hesitation. I love you, Andrea. I should have said it before now. The declaration should have been a moment of pure joy, but the circumstances cast a shadow over it. Andrea reached up to touch his face, her eyes reflecting both happiness and concern. I love you too, she replied softly. Which is why I need you to let me handle this my way. Your father and the board are looking for evidence that I'm controlling you, or that you're making irrational decisions because of me. Don't give them ammunition. Norman pressed his forehead to hers, the tension in his body palpable. When did you become the strategic one in this relationship? I've always been strategic, she reminded him with a small smile. How do you think a plus-size woman succeeded in the image-conscious art world? I learned early to pick my battles and fight them on my terms. The board meeting was scheduled for the following morning. Despite Andrea's advice to approach the situation calmly, Norman spent the evening making calls, his voice growing increasingly tense as he attempted to secure support from key board members. While he worked, Andrea retreated to the studio that had once belonged to Norman's mother, finding solace among the creative remnants of a woman she'd never met, but whose spirit seemed to linger in the space. The half-finished painting Norman had been working on still sat on the easel, the stormy landscape now featuring a small figure standing resolute against the gathering clouds. Andrea studied it, recognizing the emotional truth in the image, a solitary figure facing forces beyond their control. Acting on instinct, she picked up a brush and mixed colors on the palette, carefully adding a second figure beside the first, not dominating the composition, but complementing it, two forms standing together against the storm. She was so absorbed in the small addition that she didn't hear Norman enter until he spoke from the doorway. "What are you doing?" His voice held no anger, only curiosity. Andrea set down the brush, suddenly uncertain. "I'm sorry, I shouldn't have—" "No," he interrupted, moving closer to study her work. "It's perfect." He looked from the painting to her, eyes soft with understanding. "That's exactly what you've been for me. Not taking over my storm, but standing beside me in it." He pulled her into his arms, holding her as if she might disappear. "Whatever happens tomorrow, I need you to know that you've changed me in ways that can't be undone. Whether the board approves or not, whether my father accepts us or not, I won't go back to who I was before you." They stood together in the studio, surrounded by the creative legacy of the woman who had shaped Norman's earliest understanding of love, making their own silent promises to honor that legacy through the storm that awaited them. The morning brought an unexpected development. As Andrea and Norman were preparing to leave for the board meeting, Mrs. Prescott arrived at the penthouse unusually early, her expression troubled. "Richard Harbrook is downstairs," she announced. "He's insisting on speaking with Andrea, alone." Norman's reaction was immediate and protective. "Absolutely not." "It's all right," Andrea assured him, though her stomach tightened with apprehension. "I'll speak with him." "Andrea, trust me," she said, squeezing his hand. "This is my battle to fight." Reluctantly, Norman agreed to remain upstairs while Andrea met Richard in the penthouse's formal living room. The elder Harbrook stood by the windows, as imperious in his expensive suit as he had been at the gala, his expression coldly calculating as she entered. "Ms. Walker," he acknowledged with a curt nod. "Thank you for agreeing to this conversation." "Mr. Harbrook," she replied evenly. "What can I do for you?" He studied her for a moment, assessing. "You're a direct woman. I appreciate that. So I'll be equally direct. I'd like you to end your relationship with my son." Though the request was expected, hearing it stated so baldly still stung. "May I ask why?" "Norman has responsibilities, to the company, to our family legacy, to shareholders who depend on his judgment." Richard's tone was matter-of-fact, as if discussing a business transaction. "His recent behavior suggests his focus has been compromised." "You mean since he started seeing me," Andrea clarified. "Since he started allowing personal feelings to influence business decisions," Richard corrected smoothly. "The East Side Initiative changes, the community focus, the public gallery plans, all departures from proven strategy, all coinciding with your arrival in his life." Andrea maintained her composure, though anger simmered beneath the surface. "Perhaps he's simply evolving as a leader, incorporating new perspectives that serve both profit and community." "A lovely sentiment," Richard dismissed. "But business isn't about sentiment. It's about consistent returns and strategic growth." "Is that all it's about?" Andrea challenged. "Is that all you taught your son to value?" Something shifted in Richard's expression, a momentary crack in his corporate facade. "I taught Norman to survive in a world that shows no mercy to the weak or sentimental." His mother filled his head with art and music and emotions that would have destroyed him in the business world I was preparing him to lead. "And you think I'm doing the same," Andrea realized, softening him, making him vulnerable. "I think you believe you're helping him," Richard allowed. "But you're actually endangering everything he's built." The board is prepared to remove him as CEO if they sense his judgment is compromised. Is that what you want for him? A threat hung in the air between them, its weight crushing in its implications. Andrea took a measured breath before responding. What I want for Norman is what any person who loves another wants, for him to be his truest, best self. She met Richard's gaze without flinching. The man I fell in love with isn't just a CEO or a Harbrook heir. He's someone who cares deeply about leaving a positive mark on the world, who sees beyond balance sheets to the lives affected by his decisions. Richard's expression hardened. Idealism has no place in our world, Miss Walker. Then perhaps your world needs to change, she countered. Because the business models of the past won't serve the future Norman is trying to build. One where profit and purpose can coexist. A future you've convinced him to pursue, Richard noted sharply. A future he's chosen, Andrea corrected. I've simply helped him reconnect with values he already held, values his mother instilled in him, before you tried to erase them. The mention of Norman's mother landed like a physical blow. Richard turned away, facing the window as he regained his composure. I won't insult you with financial offers, he said finally, his voice controlled. I suspect you'd find that offensive. But consider this, Norman's position, his influence, his ability to affect the very changes you value, all of it depends on his leadership remaining unchallenged. The board meeting today could strip him of everything he's worked for. He turned back to face her. If you truly love my son, you'll consider what's best for his future, not just your present happiness together. The manipulative logic of his argument wasn't lost on Andrea. Before she could respond, the elevator doors opened and Norman strode into the room, his expression thunderous. That's enough, Father, he said, moving to stand beside Andrea. I asked you to respect my privacy. Instead, you came to my home to intimidate the woman I love. I came to protect your future, Richard insisted. A future you seem determined to jeopardize for a relationship that has no logical foundation. Norman's laugh held no humor. Logical foundation? Is that what you had with Mother? A logical arrangement that left you so cold after her death that you couldn't even speak her name. Richard flinched, genuine emotion breaking through his controlled exterior. Don't bring your mother into this. Why not? She's been the elephant in the room for 28 years. Norman challenged. You never forgave her for dying and leaving you vulnerable, so you made sure I would never be vulnerable again. Emotion was weakness. Attachment was liability. Business was the only thing that mattered. He took Andrea's hand, drawing strength from her presence. But you were wrong, Father. What you saw as protecting me was actually diminishing me. I became exactly the CEO you wanted, successful, ruthless, empty. Until Andrea helped me remember, there was more to life, more to business, more to being a Harbrook than just accumulating wealth and power. Richard's mask of corporate detachment had crumbled completely, revealing a man haunted by old grief. Your mother was the heart of our family, he said quietly. When she died, I did what I thought necessary to protect what remained. By turning me into you, Norman observed without heat. By ensuring you would never feel the kind of pain I felt, Richard admitted, his voice barely audible. I thought if I could make you focus solely on achievement, on tangible success, you would be safe from the devastation of loss. The revelation hung in the air. Decades of misunderstanding suddenly cast in a new light. Andrea squeezed Norman's hand, feeling the tension in his body as he absorbed his father's words. You weren't protecting me, Norman said finally. You were protecting yourself, from seeing her in me, from being reminded of what you lost. Richard didn't deny it. Perhaps you're right. He straightened, corporate mask sliding back into place, though it fit less convincingly now. The board meeting begins in an hour. Whatever you decide, I suggest you both prepare yourselves. After Richard left, Norman stood motionless, processing the exchange. Andrea waited, giving him space to gather his thoughts. 28 years, he said finally. For 28 years, I believed he erased her from our lives because she didn't matter. Because business mattered more than sentiment. He turned to Andrea, his eyes reflecting decades of pain. But he did it because she mattered too much. He was trying to protect you in the only way he knew how, Andrea said gently. By teaching you not to feel. And I learned the lesson too well. Norman moved to the window, looking out at the city below, until you came along and made me feel everything again. Andrea approached, placing her hand on his back. What do you want to do about the board meeting? Norman was quiet for a long moment. What my father said, about your presence endangering my position, there's truth in that. The board is conservative, resistant to change. If they perceive my judgment as compromised, I understand, Andrea said, her voice steady despite the pain in her chest. If you need me to step back from the East Side Initiative, or from— No, Norman interrupted, turning to face her. I'm not letting them dictate my personal life or my vision for the company. If they can't see the value in both, then perhaps it's time for Harbrook Investments to continue without a Harbrook at the helm. The implications of his statement were staggering. Norman, you can't mean. I've never been more certain, he assured her, a new resolve in his expression. For years I've been living my father's version of success. Maybe it's time to define my own. The weight of his decision hung between them. A willingness to risk everything he'd built for principles he'd only recently reclaimed, and the woman who had helped him rediscover them. Are you sure? Andrea asked, searching his eyes. The company has been your life. Not my life, he corrected, drawing her close. My identity, perhaps. My purpose, certainly. But not my life. His hands framed her face with gentle reverence. You've helped me see the difference. As they prepared for the board meeting, a strange calm settled over Norman. Whatever the outcome, he had already made the most important decision, choosing authenticity over expectation, love over legacy, growth over stagnation. Andrea watched him transform before her eyes, the corporate armor he'd worn for decades giving way to something more genuine. The suit was the same, the grooming impeccable as always, but the man inside had fundamentally changed, integrated rather than compartmentalized, vulnerable yet stronger for it. Whatever happens today, she told him as they prepared to leave. I'm proud of you. His smile, genuine and unguarded, was all the response she needed. The Harbrook Investments boardroom occupied the entire top floor of their downtown headquarters, its floor-to-ceiling windows offering panoramic views of the city Norman's family had helped build. The massive oak table seated 20 board members, with Richard Harbrook at one end and Norman at the other, a physical manifestation of their opposing perspectives. Andrea had insisted on accompanying Norman to the building, but agreed to wait in his office during the actual meeting. As they stood outside the boardroom doors, Norman took her hands in his. I meant what I said earlier, he told her quietly. Whatever happens in there doesn't change us. I know, she assured him, though anxiety fluttered in her chest. So much was at stake. His position, his legacy, the community initiative they'd worked so hard to develop. Magnus approached, his expression grave. They're ready for you, Norman. He glanced at Andrea with something like sympathy. It might be better if— Andrea stays, Norman interrupted firmly. Not in the boardroom, but nearby. Whatever they decide affects her too. Magnus nodded, his loyalty to Norman evident despite his professional concerns. I've done what I can with the members I have influence with. Your father has been working the others all night. Thank you, Norman said. Genuine appreciation in his voice. For standing by me even when you thought I was making a mistake. I'm still not convinced you aren't, Magnus admitted with a hint of his usual wry humor. But I've learned not to bet against you. He glanced at Andrea, or the people who inspire you. As Norman entered the boardroom, Andrea retreated to his office, the weight stretching before her like an eternity. Through the glass walls, she could see staff moving with heightened awareness. The tension in the building palpable as rumors of the emergency meeting circulated. Andrea paced, her mind racing with contingency plans. If Norman lost his position, what would happen to the East Side Initiative, to the community center, to the vision they'd built together? And beyond the professional implications, what would it mean for them personally if his entire life was upended because of their relationship? After nearly an hour, the office door opened. Andrea turned, expecting Magnus or perhaps Norman himself, but found Mrs. Prescott instead. I thought you might need some company, the housekeeper said, her kind eyes reflecting understanding. These waits can be unbearable alone. Thank you, Andrea said, genuinely grateful for the older woman's presence. Have you been through this before? Board challenges to Norman's leadership? Nothing like this. Mrs. Prescott admitted, settling into a chair. But I've watched that family navigate crises for 30 years. Since before Norman's mother died. Andrea sat across from her. You knew her well? Isabel? A smile softened Mrs. Prescott's features. Oh yes, she was nothing like what you'd expect in a billionaire's wife. Warm, genuine, passionate about art and music and making the world better. She volunteered at community centers, taught piano to underprivileged children, opened their home to people from all walks of life. The description aligned perfectly with the woman Andrea had imagined from Norman's stories and the creative spirit that lingered in her studio. Richard adored her, Mrs. Prescott continued, surprising Andrea. They were opposites in many ways, but she softened his edges, gave him purpose beyond wealth accumulation. When she died, something broke in him. He couldn't bear to be reminded of her, so he tried to erase her from their lives, packed away her things, closed up her studio, forbade Norman from playing the piano. Norman said his father never spoke of her after the accident, Andrea noted. Not where Norman could hear, Mrs. Prescott corrected. But sometimes, late at night, I would find Richard in Isabel's studio, talking to her paintings as if she could hear him. The grief was too much for him to process, so he did the only thing he knew how to do. He buried himself in work and taught Norman to do the same. The revelation cast Richard in a new light. Not a cold, unfeeling businessman, but a broken man who had chosen emotional numbness over unbearable pain. When you came into Norman's life, Mrs. Prescott continued, I saw something I hadn't seen in 28 years, glimpses of the boy he was when Isabel was alive. Curious, passionate, willing to challenge convention. Her eyes grew misty. You've given him back pieces of himself that I thought were lost forever. Before Andrea could respond, the office door opened again. Magnus entered, his expression unreadable. They're ready for you, he said to Andrea. Both of you. Andrea's heart raced as she followed Magnus back to the boardroom. The request for her presence could mean anything. Perhaps they wanted to question her directly. Or maybe they had already made their decision and wanted her to hear it alongside Norman. As they approached the boardroom doors, Magnus paused. Whatever happens in there, he said quietly, know that you've been good for him. Better than any of us expected. The boardroom fell silent as Andrea entered. 20 pairs of eyes turned to her, expressions ranging from curiosity to open hostility. Norman stood at the far end of the table, his posture relaxed despite the tension in the room. Beside him, Richard Harbrook sat rigidly in his chair, his expression impossible to read. Ms. Walker, one of the board members acknowledged. Thank you for joining us. Norman has been sharing his vision for the company's future, including the East Side initiative you've been developing together. Andrea moved to stand beside Norman, his hand finding hers beneath the edge of the table, out of sight of the board members. The board has concerns, the member continued, about recent changes in strategic direction and what has influenced these changes. I understand, Andrea replied calmly. Change can be unsettling, especially when it challenges established patterns. This is more than unsettling, another board member interjected. It's a fundamental shift in investment philosophy that coincides directly with your involvement in Norman's life. Norman stepped forward. As I've explained, the East Side initiative represents an evolution of our approach, not an abandonment of sound business principles. The projected ROI actually exceeds our traditional development model when factoring in tax incentives, community goodwill, and sustainable occupancy rates. Numbers can be manipulated to support any narrative, a skeptical board member countered. Yes, they can, Norman agreed unexpectedly. Just as they've been manipulated for years to support the narrative that maximum short-term profit is the only measure of success. He surveyed the room, making eye contact with each board member. But there are other metrics worth considering: community impact, sustainability, ethical standing, employee satisfaction. Metrics that Andrea helped me recognize not as soft sentimentality, but as crucial elements of long-term business viability. The room fell silent, his words hanging in the air. Norman continued, his voice steady and confident. My father built this company, focusing solely on financial growth. It was the right approach for his time. He glanced at Richard, whose expression remained carefully neutral. But times change, markets evolve, new generations of investors and clients seek partners whose values align with their own. The East Side Initiative isn't a departure from sound business. It's an adaptation to changing realities. And your personal relationship with Miss Walker, one board member asked pointedly. The tabloids suggest. The tabloids, Norman interrupted firmly, are irrelevant to this discussion. My personal life is my own. But yes, Andrea has influenced my thinking, just as any valuable advisor would. She's challenged me to see opportunities I was missing, to consider perspectives I'd ignored. That's not weakness. That's leadership, surrounding yourself with people who expand your vision rather than simply reinforce it. Andrea felt a surge of pride at his words, at the man he had become, neither the cold corporate automaton his father had shaped, nor a rudderless idealist, but something more integrated and powerful than either. The board needs to decide, Norman concluded, whether Harbrook Investments will evolve under my leadership or remain locked in approaches that serve the past rather than the future. If you choose the latter, I'm prepared to step down today. A murmur rippled through the room at his ultimatum. Richard Harbrook rose from his seat, all eyes turning to him expectantly. My son, he began, his voice carrying the weight of authority earned over decades, has always been stubborn, from childhood, when he insisted on learning piano despite my preference for more practical pursuits, to today, standing before you, challenging conventions I myself established. He moved around the table, his steps measured and deliberate. That stubbornness, that willingness to stand firm in his convictions even when facing opposition, is precisely what has made him an exceptional CEO. One who has doubled our company's value in 10 years. Andrea felt Norman tense beside her, clearly not expecting his father's support. As for Miss Walker's influence, Richard continued, stopping before them. I've had the opportunity to observe it firsthand. What the tabloids call inappropriate, I now recognize as something else entirely. A partnership that challenges and strengthens, that brings balance where there was imbalance. He turned to address the board directly. Isabel, my late wife and Norman's mother, used to tell me that the best business decisions come from the head and the heart working in harmony. I forgot that wisdom after we lost her. It seems my son has rediscovered it. The admission, public and unequivocal, clearly stunned the board members. Richard straightened, corporate authority reasserting itself. As chairman of this board and majority shareholder of Harbrook Investments, I move that we formally approve the East Side Initiative as presented, with Andrea Walker installed as permanent director of community engagement. His gaze swept the room, challenging opposition, unless anyone wishes to object. The silence that followed was answer enough. As the meeting adjourned, board members filed out, many stopping to congratulate Norman or introduce themselves to Andrea with newfound respect. When only Norman, Andrea, and Richard remained, the elder Harbrook faced them directly. I owe you both an apology, he said, the words clearly unfamiliar on his tongue. Norman, I've spent 28 years trying to protect you from pain by teaching you not to feel. It was misguided. Why the change of heart? Norman asked, genuine curiosity in his voice. Richard's gaze shifted to Andrea. Miss Walker reminded me of Isabel. Not in appearance or background, but in essence. The same clear-eyed challenge to convention, the same refusal to be intimidated by wealth or status. A ghost of a smile touched his lips. The same effect on a Harbrook man. The comparison to Norman's beloved mother was perhaps the highest compliment Richard could offer. Andrea accepted it with a gracious nod. I still have concerns about public perception, Richard admitted. The media can be brutal. We'll handle it, Norman assured him. Together. As they left the boardroom, Norman pulled Andrea into a private alcove, his expression the mixture of disbelief and elation. I did not see that coming, he admitted. My father hasn't mentioned my mother's name in decades, let alone invoked her wisdom in a board meeting. People can surprise you, Andrea said, still processing the unexpected turn of events herself, even after a lifetime of knowing them. Norman brushed a strand of hair from her face, his touch gentle with wonder. You know what this means? The East Side Initiative is officially approved. The community center is safe. Your position is secured. Our vision, Andrea corrected, smiling up at him. Our achievement. Norman's eyes grew serious, despite his smile. There's still the public relations challenge. The tabloids won't stop just because the board is on board. I know, she acknowledged, but I think I have an idea about that too. 2 weeks later, Andrea stood in the renovated East Side Community Center, watching as local children explored the new art supplies and equipment their program had received. The space had been transformed, bright, welcoming, and humming with creative energy. Jasmine approached, Ellie's hand in hers. I still can't believe this is real, she said, taking in the vibrant murals and well-equipped classrooms. When you said the center would be improved, I didn't imagine anything like this. Neither did I at first, Andrea admitted. It took both of us, Norman's resources and my vision, to make it happen. Speaking of your billionaire, Jasmine nodded toward the entrance, where Norman had appeared. Looking surprisingly at ease in this community setting, so different from his usual corporate environments. Several children immediately approached him, excited to show him their artwork. He's good with them, Jasmine observed, with mild surprise. He's finding his way back to parts of himself that were buried long ago, Andrea explained, watching as Norman knelt to admire a child's painting, his genuine interest evident in his expression. The center's grand reopening ceremony was scheduled for that evening, a gala event that would bring together corporate donors, community members, and media representatives. It was a calculated risk, Norman and Andrea's first official public appearance since the tabloid frenzy, but one they had planned carefully. Later, as Andrea prepared in the small office that was now hers, Norman knocked and entered, carrying a garment bag. A delivery for the Director of Community Engagement, he announced with a smile. Andrea unzipped the bag to reveal a stunning gown in rich lilac that would complement her curves perfectly. Norman, it's beautiful, but before you protest, he interrupted gently. This isn't from me personally. It's from the PR budget for tonight's event. All the key staff received appropriate attire allowances. She raised an eyebrow skeptically. And the PR budget just happened to select a gown in my favorite color that's exactly my size? The PR department might have received some specific guidance, he admitted with a mischievous smile. Consider it a professional courtesy from your CEO. Andrea laughed, accepting the gown. Speaking of the CEO, are you ready for tonight? The press will be watching our every move. Let them watch, Norman said, his confidence unwavering. We have nothing to hide and everything to be proud of. He took her hands in his. Besides, after facing down the board and my father, a few photographers seemed rather manageable. As evening fell, the community center was transformed by subtle lighting and elegant decorations that complemented rather than overshadowed its primary purpose. Community members mingled with corporate executives, artists chatted with investors, and children proudly displayed their work to anyone who would look. Andrea moved through the space in her lilac gown, greeting guests and explaining the center's programs with passionate expertise. From across the room, she could see Norman engaged in similar conversations, occasionally catching her eye with a warm smile that made her heart skip despite the public setting. Photographers circulated discreetly, documenting the event for press releases and social media. The strategy they had developed with the PR team is simple but effective. Rather than hiding from public scrutiny, they would redirect it toward the work itself, the community initiative, the art programs, the positive impact on the neighborhood. As the formal presentation approached, Andrea felt a flutter of nerves. According to the program, Norman would speak first as CEO of Harbrick Investments, followed by Andrea as Director of Community Engagement. It would be their first time addressing the public together since the tabloid storm. The room quieted as Norman took the small stage, commanding attention effortlessly in his perfectly tailored tuxedo. Thank you all for coming tonight to celebrate the reopening of the East Side Community Center, he began, his voice warm and confident. This initiative represents more than just a business investment or a charitable contribution. It represents a new vision for corporate community engagement, one where profit and purpose exist in harmony. His gaze found Andrea in the crowd, his expression softening visibly. I've learned recently that the best business decisions, the best life decisions, come from integrating seeming opposites, head and heart, tradition and innovation, corporate strength and community wisdom. The audience listened attentively as Norman outlined the center's programs and the broader initiative's goals. As he concluded, he gestured toward Andrea. None of this would have been possible without the vision and expertise of our Director of Community Engagement, Andrea Walker. Her background as a curator at Hamilton Gallery brought professional art world experience to this project. But it's her passionate belief in art's transformative power that truly shaped what you see tonight. As Andrea made her way to the stage, a ripple of appreciation moved through the crowd. Norman extended his hand to her, a simple gesture that spoke volumes about their partnership, professional and personal, public and private. "Thank you, Norman," she began, her voice steady despite the cameras capturing every moment. "And thank you all for supporting this vision of what community engagement can truly be." As she spoke about the programs and the children who would benefit from them, Andrea felt a profound sense of rightness. This was what she had trained for, what she had passionate about throughout her career, making art accessible to all, regardless of background or circumstance. "Art has the power to transform how we see ourselves and our world," she continued. "It teaches us to look beyond surface appearances to the beauty and truth beneath. It helps us recognize value where others might see only limitation." Her gaze met Norman's briefly, the double meaning of her words clear to him, if not to the entire audience. "The East Side Initiative isn't just about improving a building or funding programs," she concluded. "It's about recognizing the inherent value in every person, every community, every perspective, even those that might initially seem to come from different worlds." The applause that followed was genuine and enthusiastic. As Andrea stepped away from the microphone, Norman rejoined her on stage, his hand finding the small of her back in a gesture that was both supportive and subtly possessive. "There's one more announcement I'd like to make tonight," he said, addressing the crowd once more. "Harbrook Investments will be establishing the Isabel Harbrook Foundation for Arts Access, with an initial endowment of $20 million to support community art initiatives throughout the city." A murmur of surprise and approval rippled through the audience. In the front row, Richard Harbrook stood straight-backed, but with undisguised emotion in his eyes at the mention of his late wife's name. "My mother believed that art belonged to everyone," Norman continued, his voice carrying the weight of personal significance. "That beauty and creativity weren't luxuries but necessities for a full and meaningful life. The foundation will ensure that her vision continues for generations to come." As the formal presentation concluded and guests returned to mingling, Norman and Andrea found themselves approached by a reporter from one of the publications that had run the most unflattering coverage of their relationship. "Mr. Harbrook, Miss Walker," the reporter acknowledged with professional politeness. "Quite a successful event tonight. Would you care to comment on how your personal relationship has influenced this initiative?" Andrea felt Norman tense slightly beside her, but his voice remained calm and measured. "Andrea and I share a vision for what business can achieve when it looks beyond traditional metrics of success," he replied. "Our personal connection has certainly deepened my appreciation for perspectives I might once have overlooked, but the initiative stands on its own merits." "And the criticism about Miss Walker's qualifications for her position?" the reporter pressed. "My resume speaks for itself," Andrea interjected smoothly. "Hamilton Gallery's successful community outreach programs during my tenure there are well documented. Anyone questioning my professional credentials is welcome to review my work there and now." The reporter nodded, making notes. "One final question. How do you respond to those who suggest that your relationship represents an unusual choice for someone of Mr. Harbrook's position and background?" Andrea felt Norman's hand tighten on hers, but before he could respond, she spoke, her voice clear and confident. "I would suggest that true value isn't always apparent at first glance, in art, in business, or in relationships." Her smile was genuine but firm. "Looking beyond surface judgments to recognize authentic worth is a skill worth cultivating in all aspects of life, wouldn't you agree?" The reporter's eyes widened slightly at the graceful rebuke. "Indeed. Thank you both for your time." As the evening drew to a close, Norman and Andrea found a quiet moment alone in her new office, the sounds of the departing guests muffled by the closed door. "You are magnificent tonight," Norman said, drawing her into his arms. "The way you handled that reporter, elegant but unmistakable." "I've had practice dealing with people who underestimate me," she reminded him with a smile. Though having the CEO of Harbrook Investments beside me certainly didn't hurt, Norman's expression grew serious. "The CEO of Harbrook Investments wants to be beside you for a lot more than press conferences and galas." "Is that so?" Andrea teased, though her heart quickened at his tone. "I've been thinking about what matters most in life," he continued, his eyes never leaving hers. "What real success looks like, what happiness feels like." His hand caressed her cheek with tender reverence. "And all roads lead back to you, Andrea." The vulnerability in his expression took her breath away. This man who had once hidden behind corporate armor now stood before her completely open, his heart evident in every word, every touch. "I love you," he said simply. "Not despite our differences, but because of how they've changed us both. You've helped me become more of who I was meant to be. I hope I've done the same for you." "You have," she assured him, her voice soft with emotion. "You've helped me see my own value more clearly, to stand firm in who I am without apology." Norman's smile was tender as he brushed a strand of hair from her face. "Then perhaps we should consider making this partnership permanent, in every sense." Though he hadn't explicitly asked the question, its implication hung between them. A future together, officially acknowledged, no matter what the tabloids or board members or society pages might say. "Are you sure?" Andrea asked, searching his eyes. "Your world is better with you in it," he finished. "The rest is just details." Their kiss sealed the unspoken promise between them, to face whatever came next together. Two figures standing strong against life's storms, complementing rather than diminishing each other's unique strengths. Outside the office window, the lights of the community center glowed warmly in the night. A beacon of what was possible when different worlds found common ground, when authentic connection transcended surface judgments, when love dared to redefine success on its own terms. 6 months later, the East Side Community Arts Center stood as a testament to transformation, both of the neighborhood it served and the people who had created it. What had begun as a standard corporate development project had evolved into something far more meaningful, a vibrant hub where children discovered artistic talents. Local artists found exhibition space, and community members of all backgrounds gathered to create and connect. Andrea moved through the sunlit gallery space, making final adjustments to the exhibition that would open that evening. A new vision, Community Perspectives, featured works from local artists, alongside selections from the Harbrook Private Collection, a deliberate juxtaposition of established masters and emerging talents that erased traditional hierarchies of artistic value. "The lighting on the Martinez piece still isn't quite right," she murmured, more to herself than to Mrs. Prescott, who had accompanied her for the final preparations. "You've adjusted it 3 times already, dear," the older woman noted with gentle amusement. "It looks perfect to me." "I want everything to be perfect tonight," Andrea admitted, stepping back to assess the overall effect. "It's more than just an exhibition opening." "Indeed it is," Mrs. Prescott agreed, a knowing smile playing at her lips. "Though I suspect the guests of honor will be too focused on each other to notice if one painting is lit slightly differently than the others." Andrea laughed, acknowledging the truth in her words. Tonight's event would celebrate not only the Art Center's successful first 6 months, but also serve as a formal engagement announcement for her and Norman. A deliberate choice to tie their personal milestone to the community project that had brought them together. The past months had seen remarkable changes for them both. Norman had continued to evolve as a business leader, integrating community impact metrics into all Harbrook investment projects, while maintaining the strong financial performance that kept shareholders satisfied. The board that had once questioned his judgment now celebrated his innovative approach as visionary. For Andrea, the position as Director of Community Engagement had blossomed into a role that utilized all her curatorial expertise, while allowing her to mentor emerging artists from backgrounds typically underrepresented in the art world. Several major galleries had approached her about joint exhibitions, recognizing the fresh perspectives she brought to the cultural landscape. Most surprisingly, Richard Harbrook had become an unexpected ally, his initial resistance giving way to genuine respect for both Andrea's professional contributions and her influence on his son. The Isabel Harbrook Foundation now occupied a significant portion of his time and attention, a way of honoring his late wife's memory that seemed to have softened some of his long-held grief. "Andrea?" Norman's voice drew her from her reflections. He stood in the gallery entrance, looking more relaxed and authentic than the corporate automaton she'd first encountered in his penthouse. Though still impeccably dressed in a tailored suit, he carried himself differently now. Less armor, more ease. "What do you think?" she asked, gesturing to the exhibition space. Norman surveyed the gallery with appreciative eyes. "It's extraordinary, like everything you create." Mrs. Prescott tactfully excused herself, leaving them alone amid the artwork that represented their shared vision. "Hard to believe this was almost luxury condominiums," Andrea mused, thinking back to the business proposal that had sparked their first real conflict. Thank goodness for stubborn art curators who refuse to let billionaires have their way. Norman replied with a smile, drawing her into his arms. "And for billionaires willing to listen," she countered, leaning into his embrace. Norman glanced at his watch. "We have 3 hours before guests arrive. More than enough time to go home and change." "Home," Andrea repeated softly, still adjusting to the word's new meaning in her life. After months of dividing their time between his penthouse and her apartment, they had recently purchased a brownstone together, a space that belonged equally to both of them, with a studio from Norman's rediscovered painting hobby, ample wall space for their growing art collection, and most significantly, a piano in the living room that no longer stood silent. As they left the art center, Andrea noticed a small girl watching an artist complete a mural on the building's exterior wall. The child's expression of wonder reminded her powerfully of Ellie's response to art, that pure, unfiltered appreciation that transcended background or circumstance. "That's why we do this," she said quietly to Norman, nodding toward the scene. He followed her gaze, understanding immediately. "Yes," he agreed. That moment of connection, of possibility. In the car, heading home, Norman seemed unusually reflective, his fingers laced with hers, but his gaze distant. "What are you thinking about?" Andrea asked. "My mother," he admitted. "She would have loved what we've created here. The foundation, the arts center, all of it. I think she would have loved seeing who you've become even more," Andrea said gently. Norman smiled, squeezing her hand. "I found something yesterday, while we were moving the last of my things from the penthouse." A journal of hers that had been tucked away in her studio. Andrea waited, sensing the significance of the discovery. "There was an entry from just a few weeks before the accident," he continued. "She wrote about her hopes for me. Not that I would take over the family business, or increase the Harbrook fortune, but that I would find someone who would see me completely and love me anyway." His voice grew rough with emotion. "Someone who would help me remember to play the music, not just read the notes." The metaphor, so perfectly capturing what had developed between them, brought tears to Andrea's eyes. "She would be proud of you," she said softly, "for finding your way back to her wisdom, even after all these years." At home, as they prepared for the evening ahead, Andrea found herself reflecting on the journey that had brought them to this moment. From her first day cleaning his penthouse to tonight's engagement announcement, the path had been neither straight nor easy. There had been public scrutiny, professional challenges, family resistance, all the complications one might expect when two people from such different worlds came together. Yet somehow, those very differences had created something stronger and more beautiful than either could have built alone. Norman's resources and influence combined with Andrea's artistic vision and community connections. His strategic mind balanced by her intuitive understanding. His need for structure complemented by her appreciation for creative flexibility. In their bedroom, Norman emerged from the closet holding a small velvet box. "I know we already discussed this," he said, approaching her with uncharacteristic nervousness, "and you already said yes. But I realize I never did this properly." Andrea's heart quickened as he opened the box to reveal a ring, unlike any she might have expected from a man of his wealth and position. Rather than an ostentatious diamond, it featured a stunning opal surrounded by smaller stones in an artistic, asymmetrical setting. "It was my mother's," Norman explained. "Not her engagement ring. That was the traditional diamond my father thought appropriate for a Harbrook bride. This was one she chose for herself, designed by an artist she discovered at a small gallery." The significance of the choice, offering her something personal and meaningful rather than simply expensive, brought tears to Andrea's eyes. "My father thought it inappropriate for someone of her station," Norman continued with a small smile. "She wore it anyway, said it reminded her to value authenticity over expectation." He took the ring from its box, holding it poised at her finger. "Andrea Walker, you've taught me to see beauty where I once saw only balance sheets, to find strength in vulnerability, and to value connection over convention. Will you marry me not as a billionaire's wife, but as my equal partner in creating a life that matters?" "Yes," she whispered, the single word carrying the weight of all they'd overcome and all they hoped to build together. "With my whole heart, yes." As he slipped the ring onto her finger, the opal caught the light, reflecting flashes of blue and green and gold, colors that shifted and changed depending on the angle, just as their relationship had revealed new facets and depths with each challenge they faced together. Later that evening, the art center hummed with energy as guests arrived for the exhibition opening. Community members mingled with art world elites, corporate executives chatted with local artists, and children proudly showed off their work to anyone who would look. The space that had once been slated for luxury development had become something far more valuable, a bridge between worlds that rarely connected. Andrea moved through the crowd in a gown that celebrated rather than concealed her curves, its deep emerald color complementing the opal on her finger. She noticed with satisfaction how genuinely engaged Norman was as he spoke with a young artist from the neighborhood, his interest in the teenager's work evident in his focused questions and thoughtful responses. "You two are good for each other," a voice observed beside her. Andrea turned to find Jasmine, elegant in a borrowed dress, watching her sister with knowing eyes. "We are," Andrea agreed simply. "I didn't think it would work," Jasmine admitted. "A billionaire CEO and my stubborn big sister, worlds too far apart." She nodded toward Norman, who was now introducing the young artist to a gallery owner. "But he's not who I thought he was, and you're stronger than I gave you credit for." "We both had to grow," Andrea reflected. "He had to learn that wealth isn't the only measure of value. I had to learn that my worth wasn't diminished by accepting help or love from someone with more resources." Ellie ran up to them, excitement shining in her eyes. "Aunt Andrea, Mr. Mormon says I can show my paintings in the next exhibition if I keep practicing." "That's wonderful, sweetheart," Andrea replied, smoothing her niece's hair. "I told you that talent deserves recognition, no matter where it comes from." As Ellie dashed off to share the news with her friends, Jasmine squeezed Andrea's hand. "He's good with her. With all the kids here." She paused, studying her sister's face. "He'll make a good father someday." The observation, so matter-of-fact yet so profound in its implications, caught Andrea by surprise. She and Norman had discussed marriage, but not yet children, though the possibility lingered in unspoken conversations about the future. "Maybe someday," she acknowledged with a small smile. Across the room, Richard Harbrook arrived, commanding attention without effort. Andrea watched as he approached Norman, the two men exchanging words that seemed less tense than their usual interactions. To her surprise, Richard then made his way directly to her. "Ms. Walker," he greeted her with a formal nod. "Mr. Harbrook," she replied evenly. "Thank you for coming tonight." "An impressive achievement," he acknowledged, surveying the gallery, both the exhibition and the center itself. He hesitated, uncharacteristically uncertain. "Norman tells me the announcement will be made this evening." "Yes," Andrea confirmed. "We thought it fitting to share our news in this place that means so much to both of us." Richard's gaze dropped to the opal ring on her finger, recognition flashing in his eyes. "Isabel's ring," he said softly, I haven't seen it in years. Norman felt she would have wanted me to have it. Andrea explained carefully, uncertain of his reaction. To her surprise, Richard's expression softened. She would have. She always said it had a story to tell, unlike that ostentatious diamond I gave her. A ghost of a smile touched his lips. Isabel would have approved of you, Andrea. Not despite your differences from our world, but because of them. She always said the Harbrook men needed someone to challenge them, to remind them of what matters beyond balance sheets and boardrooms. The admission, so personal, so unexpected, left Andrea momentarily speechless. I haven't been welcoming, Richard continued, with painful honesty. Old habits of judgment and control are difficult to break. But I've watched how you've influenced my son, how you've helped him become more of the man his mother always hoped he would be. He extended his hand, a formal gesture carrying informal weight. Welcome to the family, Andrea. As she accepted his handshake, Andrea felt the significance of the moment. Not just personal acceptance, but the breaking of a pattern that had defined the Harbrook family for generations. The wall between business and emotion, between wealth and authentic connection, was finally crumbling. Thank you, she said simply, knowing he would understand all that those words contained. The formal announcement came later in the evening, after guests had explored the exhibition and community youth had performed a musical program. Norman took the small stage, his presence commanding attention without effort. Thank you all for being here tonight to celebrate what we've accomplished together, he began, his voice warm and confident. 6 months ago, this center opened its doors with a mission that some called idealistic, to create a space where art could transcend boundaries of class, background, and opportunity. Tonight, looking around at the incredible work on these walls and the connections being formed in this room, I believe we can say that idealism has proven its practical value. Murmurs of agreement and scattered applause rippled through the crowd. None of this would have been possible without the vision and leadership of our Director of Community Engagement, Andrea Walker, Norman continued, his eyes finding her in the crowd. Her expertise as a curator combined with her passionate belief in art's transformative power has shaped every aspect of what you see tonight. He extended his hand, inviting her to join him. Andrea moved through the crowd, feeling the weight of attention, but no longer uncomfortable beneath it. As she took her place beside Norman, his hand found hers naturally, their fingers intertwining. Andrea and I have an additional announcement to share with you tonight, Norman said, his voice softening with genuine emotion. In this place that represents so much of what we believe in together, we're pleased to tell you that we're engaged to be married. A wave of applause and congratulations swept through the room, genuine warmth evident in the response. Andrea scanned the faces before them, Jasmine beaming with pride, Mrs. Prescott dabbing at her eyes, Richard standing straight-backed but with unmistakable approval in his expression, Magnus raising a glass in salute, and countless community members whose lives had been touched by the center. When Andrea first came into my life, Norman continued, his voice carrying easily through the now quiet room, I was a man who collected beautiful things without truly seeing them, who measured success in dollars rather than difference made, who valued control above connection. His gaze turned to her, public speech becoming intimate declaration. She challenged me to look beyond surface appearances, to find authentic value, in art, in business, in myself. To recognize that true worth isn't determined by price tags or social expectations, but by the courage to be genuine in a world that often rewards conformity. Andrea felt tears threatening at the public acknowledgement of their journey together. Norman's hand tightened on hers as he continued. In honor of our engagement and the principles this center represents, we're pleased to announce the expansion of the Isabel Harbrook Foundation Scholarship Program, which will now provide full arts education funding for 50 students annually from underserved communities throughout the city. The announcement was met with enthusiastic applause, particularly from the community members present, who understood the life-changing potential of such opportunities. Art teaches us to see differently, Norman concluded, his gaze returning to Andrea. to find beauty in unexpected places, to value authenticity over appearance. These are lessons I'm still learning every day thanks to the remarkable woman beside me. As the formal program concluded and guests returned to mingling, Andrea found herself approached by the same reporter who had questioned them at the previous event, now with a notably different demeanor. "Congratulations, Ms. Walker," the journalist offered genuinely. "The exhibition is extraordinary, and of course, best wishes on your engagement." "Thank you," Andrea replied, noticing the subtle shift in how she was being addressed, with professional respect rather than barely veiled skepticism. "Your work here has generated quite a bit of interest in the art world," the reporter continued. "Several major publications are calling the community integration model revolutionary. Would you be willing to discuss your approach for a feature article?" "I'd be happy to," Andrea agreed, recognizing how the focus had shifted from her relationship with Norman to her professional accomplishments, exactly as they had hoped. "Though I'd want to include the community artists who've been essential to the program's success." "Of course," the reporter nodded, making notes. "And Mr. Harbrook, how has Harbrook Investments impacted your health been?" Inflection seemed to echo. Somehow he's not expecting anything. An ashram on the site of Dan. "Private matters in business," he said. Approach to community development evolved through this partnership. As Norman joined them, seamlessly entering the conversation with thoughtful insights about sustainable development and community engagement, Andrea felt a quiet satisfaction. The narrative had transformed, from tabloid speculation about an unlikely romance to serious coverage of innovative business and artistic approaches. Later, as the event wound down and the last guests departed, Andrea and Norman found themselves alone in the gallery, surrounded by the artwork that represented so many diverse perspectives. "What are you thinking?" Norman asked, coming to stand behind her as she gazed at a painting created by one of the center's youngest artists. A riot of color and emotion that defied traditional technique but captured pure creative joy. "That we've created something beautiful together," she replied, leaning back against him. "Something neither of us could have built alone." His arms encircled her waist, holding her close. "The center or us?" "Both," she said simply. "They're intertwined now." Norman turned her gently to face him, his expression reflective in the gallery's soft lighting. 6 months ago, I would have called this a successful corporate social responsibility initiative. Good PR, useful tax benefits, positive community impact. And now?" Andrea prompted, reading the deeper meaning in his eyes. "Now, I see it as a philosophy for living," he said quietly. "Finding value beyond traditional metrics, creating space for diverse perspectives, building connections across differences." His hand rose to caress her cheek. "Everything I've learned to value in our relationship reflected in what we've built here." The parallel wasn't lost on Andrea. How their personal journey had mirrored the transformation of the center itself, both evolving from conventional expectations into something far more meaningful and authentic. "Take me home," she said softly, reaching up to touch his face. "We have a future to plan." As they left the gallery hand in hand, Andrea glanced back at the building that had almost become luxury condominiums, but had instead become a bridge between worlds. The sign above the entrance caught the evening light. East Side Community Art Center, where different perspectives create new visions. Different perspectives, new visions. The words could have described the center, their relationship, or the life they were building together. All manifestations of the same powerful truth they had discovered through each other. That true value transcends surface judgments. That authentic connection bridges the widest divides, and that love, at its most transformative, doesn't just accept differences, but celebrates them as essential to creating something truly beautiful. My beautiful royal story family, true worth isn't measured in bank accounts or status, but in the courage to be vulnerable and authentic. When we accept ourselves fully, our bodies, our backgrounds, our whole truth, we make space for real love to enter. Whether you're wearing designer clothes or a cleaner's uniform, your value comes from within. Have you ever found connection with someone who seemed different from you on the surface? Or discovered your own worth despite others' judgments? Share your experiences in the comments below. If this story touched your heart, please like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell to join our Royal Story family. Your stories inspire mine, and I'm grateful for each of you.